This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. Greg and I had been planning this trip for months. We're both avid hunters and had heard about this secluded canyon that was supposed to be teeming with game. It was a bit of a trek to get there, about a 4-hour drive from the city, followed by a 2-hour hike into the wilderness. But we figured the remoteness would mean we'd have the place to ourselves. We set out early on a crisp fall morning, loaded up with our gear and enough supplies for a few days of camping and hunting. The drive was uneventful, just us joking around and getting psyched for the adventure ahead. When we reached the trailhead, we shouldered our heavy packs and started the long hike in. At first, everything seemed normal. We trudged along the winding trail, working up a sweat as we climbed deeper into the rugged terrain. But after about an hour, I started to notice something odd. It was eerily quiet. Now, I'm used to the sounds of nature when out in the wilderness, birds chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional snapping twig. But here there was nothing, just a heavy, oppressive silence. I mentioned it to Greg and he agreed it was strange. We chalked it up to the unique geography of the canyon, figuring maybe sound just didn't carry well there. Still, it put me on edge. The silence felt unnatural, almost like the forest was holding its breath. We pushed on and finally reached our planned campsite in the early afternoon. It was a small clearing near a stream, surrounded by towering rock walls. In other circumstances it would have been breathtaking, but that unsettling silence persisted. No bubbling from the stream, no wind in the trees. Just a dead, hollow quiet. We set up camp quickly, wanting to get in a few hours of hunting before dark. But our enthusiasm had dimmed. Something about this place just felt wrong. We spent a tense couple hours stalking through the woods, but didn't see a single animal, not even tracks or droppings. It was like the canyon was completely devoid of life. As the sun began to set, we returned to camp feeling uneasy. Neither of us wanted to admit it, but we were both spooked. We got a fire going and tried to lighten the mood with some forced banter, but our voices sounded flat and muffled in the stillness. Night fell swiftly, plunging the canyon into an inky blackness. We huddled close to the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the looming rock walls. That's when we heard it for the first time, a faint, eerie echo drifting through the darkness. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then Greg's head snapped up. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, straining my ears. There it was again, a distant, warped sound, almost like a voice, but not quite. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. We sat frozen, barely breathing as we listened. The echo grew louder, more distinct. It was definitely some kind of vocalization, but utterly inhuman. A wailing, keening noise that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and it seemed to be getting closer. Suddenly the sound shifted, splitting into multiple overlapping echoes. It was as if a chorus of those unearthly voices was circling our camp, calling back and forth to each other. The noise built to a fever pitch, drowning out the crackling of our fire. Panic set in. Greg and I scrambled to our feet, wild-eyed and trembling. Without a word, we both knew we had to get out of there now. We hastily grabbed what gear we could and took off running down the trail, leaving most of our supplies behind. The echoes pursued us as we fled. Those horrible voices seemed to be all around us, swooping and diving through the canyon. I could almost feel them breathing down my neck. My lungs burned and branches whipped at my face, but sheer terror kept me sprinting headlong through the pitch-black forest. I lost all sense of time and direction as we ran. Minutes or hours could have passed, I couldn't tell. All I knew was that we had to escape that nightmare canyon and those ungodly echoes. Several times I stumbled and fell, but Greg hauled me back to my feet and we pressed on. Finally, mercifully, the echoes began to fade. We slowed our frantic pace, gasping for air. The first pale light of dawn was just starting to illuminate the trail. We'd been running all night without realizing it. We staggered the rest of the way back to Greg's truck in a daze. Neither of us spoke. We were too shell-shocked by what we'd experienced. The drive home passed in a blur. It wasn't until we pulled into my driveway that the reality of it all hit me. What the hell was that? I croaked, my voice hoarse. Greg just shook his head, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I don't know, man. I don't want to know. Let's just never talk about this again, okay? I nodded numbly. We went our separate ways, both of us eager to try and forget the horrors of that night. But I can't forget. In the months and years since, I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was some kind of mass hallucination brought on by tainted water or noxious fumes in the canyon. Maybe we stumbled into some kind of secret military testing ground. Or maybe, just maybe, there are things in this world beyond human understanding. All I know is that I've never gone hunting again. I can't bring myself to set foot in the wilderness. The quiet of the forest that I once found peaceful now fills me with dread. Because in that silence, I'm always listening for those echoes. I've thought about reporting our experience to the authorities, but who would believe such an insane story? And part of me is terrified of drawing attention to that place. What if someone went to investigate and awakened whatever lurks in that God-forsaken canyon? So I've kept quiet all these years, carrying the weight of that night alone. Greg and I drifted apart. I think seeing each other was just too painful a reminder. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just a vivid nightmare. But then I'll catch a faint echo on the wind and feel that primal terror all over again. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened to us in that canyon. All I can do is try to move on with my life and pray that those unearthly voices remain confined to that remote wilderness. But a part of me will always be listening, always wondering when I might hear those echoes again. The rest stop was pretty run down, just a small building with restrooms and some vending machines. There were only a couple other cars in the parking lot. As Tom ran off to use the bathroom, I grabbed some snacks from the vending machine. I remember feeling uneasy, like someone was watching me, but I brushed it off as just being tired from driving all day. When Tom came back, we got in the car and hit the road again. Everything seemed normal at first. We were chatting and listening to music as the sun started to set. About 20 minutes after leaving the rest stop, I noticed a white pickup truck behind us, flashing its lights and honking. At first, I thought the driver was just being a jerk, tailgating us on the dark highway. But he kept at it, getting more and more aggressive. I started to get nervous. What did this guy want? Was he drunk or on drugs? I sped up a little, hoping he'd back off. But he matched my speed, still flashing and honking. Tom was getting scared in the back seat, asking what was going on. I tried to reassure him, but I was freaking out inside. Finally, the truck managed to pull up alongside us. The driver was waving his arms frantically and yelling something. I couldn't make out what he was saying over the road noise. Against my better judgment, I rolled down my window a crack to hear him. "There's someone in your back seat," he shouted. My blood ran cold. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a dark shape crouched behind Tom's seat that definitely wasn't there before. Tom was oblivious, still looking at the truck driver. Everything happened so fast after that. I slammed on the brakes and swerved onto the shoulder. Tom screamed as we skidded to a stop. I yelled at him to get out of the car now. As soon as we stopped, I heard the back door fly open. A man in dark clothes leapt out and started sprinting down the highway. The pickup truck had stopped behind us. The driver jumped out and started chasing after the guy, yelling for him to stop. But the man who'd been hiding in our car was surprisingly fast. He disappeared into the woods alongside the road within seconds. Tom was crying hysterically. I grabbed him and held him close, my heart pounding. The pickup driver jogged back, out of breath. He explained he'd seen the man sneak into our car back at the rest stop while we were inside. He'd been trying to warn us for miles. We called the police, but they never found the guy. To this day, I have no idea who he was or what he wanted. Robbery, kidnapping, something worse. I try not to think about it. The whole thing probably only lasted a few minutes, but it felt like hours. I keep replaying it in my mind, thinking of all the what-ifs. What if that truck driver hadn't been there? What if I hadn't stopped when I did? It's been months, but I still have trouble sleeping. Every little noise makes me jump. I'm constantly checking the back seat of my car now, even in broad daylight. Tom has nightmares sometimes. He doesn't like riding in the car anymore, especially at night. I know we were lucky. So many awful things could have happened. But I can't shake the feeling of violation, knowing some stranger was silently sitting behind us for who knows how long. What was he waiting for? What would he have done if we hadn't stopped? I'm sharing this as a warning to others. Always be aware of your surroundings, even in places that seem safe. Check your car before getting in, especially after stopping somewhere unfamiliar. And if another driver is trying to get your attention, don't automatically assume they're the threat. They might be trying to warn you of danger. This experience has changed me. I used to love road trips, the freedom of the open road. Now I'm anxious every time we have to drive somewhere. I find myself avoiding rest stops and gas stations in rural areas. I know it's probably an overreaction, but I can't help it. The police told us this kind of thing is rare, but it does happen. They think the guy might have been waiting at the rest stop, looking for an opportunity. It's scary to think how easily he got into our car without us noticing. I always thought I was observant, but I never saw a thing. I'm trying to move past it, for Tom's sake if nothing else. But it's hard. Every time I see a white pickup truck on the road, my heart starts racing. I find myself constantly looking in the rearview mirror, checking the back seat. Rationally, I know lightning probably won't strike twice, but that fear is always there now, lurking in the back of my mind. We've talked about getting therapy, both for Tom and myself. It might help us process what happened. But part of me is afraid to dig too deep into it. What if talking about it just makes the fear worse? I guess the hardest part is the not knowing. Not knowing who that man was, what he wanted, why he chose us. Not knowing what might have happened if things had gone differently. My mind conjures up all sorts of horrible scenarios. I try to focus on the positives. We're safe. Nothing bad actually happened to us. We have each other. But then I'll see something on the news about a kidnapping or a carjacking, and it all comes rushing back. I know I need to find a way to move forward. I can't live in fear forever. But it's so hard to let your guard down after something like this. How do you trust the world again when your sense of safety has been shattered? For now, we're taking it one day at a time, slowly venturing out more, trying to reclaim some normalcy. It's a process. Some days are better than others, but that night on the highway in West Virginia will always be with us, a stark reminder of how quickly things can change. To anyone reading this, please be careful out there. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And never take your safety for granted. It only takes a moment for everything to change. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe on the road again, but I'm trying. For Tom's sake, and for my own. We can't let fear control our lives, but we'll never forget that night, or how close we came to God knows what. Stay safe out there, everyone. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows. The first few hours of the drive were great. We were singing along to our favorite songs, joking around, and looking forward to the awesome lineup of bands we'd be seeing. But things took a dark turn when we got onto a long stretch of isolated highway, cutting through dense forest. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to set when we first saw him. A tall, thin man in a dark coat standing motionless on the side of the road near a small bridge. As we drove past, I noticed his face was unnaturally pale, and he was staring directly at our car with an intense, unblinking gaze. It sent a chill down my spine. "Did you guys see that creepy dude back there?" I asked. Jason glanced in the rearview mirror. "Yeah, that was weird. Probably just some hitchhiker, though." We tried to shrug it off, but about 15 minutes later, we saw him again. The exact same man, in the same coat, with the same unnerving stare, standing in the exact same position near another small bridge. It was impossible. There's no way he could have gotten ahead of us. "Okay, what the hell?" Emma said, voicing what we were all thinking. "How did he get here so fast?" "Maybe it's just someone who looks similar," Maria suggested, but she sounded uncertain. Jason was visibly unnerved now, too. He pressed down on the accelerator, speeding up to put some distance between us and the strange figure. For the next hour, we were all on edge, scanning the sides of the road. The sun had fully set now, and the forest seemed to press in on either side of the highway, the trees casting eerie shadows in our headlights. We thought we were in the clear until we rounded a bend, and there he was again. This time he was standing directly in the middle of the road about 100 yards ahead of us. Jason slammed on the brakes and we skidded to a stop. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at us with that same fixed expression. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. "This isn't possible," Jason muttered. "What the fuck is going on?" Emma was on the verge of tears. "Let's turn around. I don't want to go near him." Jason put the car in reverse, but as he started to back up, our headlights illuminated another figure standing behind the car. The same man. How had he gotten there so quickly and silently? "Oh my God," Maria whimpered. We were trapped. The man in front hadn't moved, but the one behind us started walking slowly towards the car. Jason threw the car into drive and swerved around the figure in the road. As we sped past, I could have sworn I saw a slight smile on the man's face. Jason drove as fast as he dared on the winding forest road. We were all freaking out, trying to make sense of what was happening. Emma was sobbing in the back seat while Maria attempted to comfort her. "My phone has no signal," I said, checking desperately for bars. "Does anyone else have service?" They all checked, but no one could get through. We were completely cut off. After driving for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, we came to a crossroads. Jason pulled over so we could try to figure out where we were and which way to go. That's when we noticed something chilling. The road signs all pointed to the same places we had passed hours ago. Somehow, we had looped back to where we started. "This is impossible," Jason said, his voice shaking. "We've been driving straight the whole time. How can we be back here?" Before anyone could respond, there was a tapping sound on the car window right next to me. I turned and came face to face with the pale man, his face inches from the glass. I screamed, and Jason floored it, peeling away from the crossroads. The next few hours were a nightmare. No matter which way we turned or how far we drove, we kept ending up at the same crossroads. And every time, the man would be there waiting. Sometimes on the side of the road, sometimes in the middle, sometimes tapping on our windows, but always with that same penetrating stare. We were exhausted, terrified, and felt like we were losing our minds. The car was running low on gas, and we knew we couldn't keep driving in circles forever. Around 3 a.m., Emma had an idea. What if we just stop and confront him? Maybe that's what he wants. We were desperate enough to try anything at that point. The next time we saw him, Jason pulled over. With shaking legs, we got out of the car. The man stood about 20 feet away, perfectly still. Up close, I could see his skin had an odd, waxy quality to it. His eyes were so dark they looked like empty sockets. "What do you want from us?" Jason called out, his voice cracking. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the man's mouth opened unnaturally wide, and he let out a bone-chilling shriek that didn't sound human. We all clapped our hands over our ears. When the sound stopped, I opened my eyes, and he was gone, vanished into thin air. We looked around wildly, but there was no sign of him. The oppressive atmosphere that had been suffocating us all night suddenly lifted. It was like a spell had been broken. Shaken and confused, we got back in the car. This time when we drove, the roads made sense again. We found our way to the main highway and eventually made it to the music festival, though none of us were in the mood to enjoy it anymore. To this day, we have no explanation for what happened that night. We've tried researching the area, looking into local legends, everything, but found nothing that could explain our experience. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that pale, staring face, and I never drive on isolated roads at night anymore if I can help it. I don't know if it was some kind of mass hallucination, a supernatural encounter, or something else entirely, but I know that none of us will ever forget that terrifying night when we seemed to be trapped in an endless loop, haunted by an impossible figure that defied the laws of reality. Whatever it was, it shook my entire understanding of the world and left me with a bone-deep fear of dark, lonely roads. My girlfriend Audrey and I were driving back from a weekend getaway, taking the scenic route through some back roads. It was late, probably around 11 p.m., and a nasty storm had rolled in out of nowhere. The rain was coming down in sheets, pounding against the windshield so hard I could barely see 2 feet in front of the car. "Maybe we should pull over and wait it out," Audrey suggested, gripping the armrest as another gust of wind rocked the car. I nodded, squinting to try and make out any kind of shoulder or turnout where we could safely stop. After a few tense minutes of creeping along, I finally spotted a wide gravel area and carefully steered the car off the road. We sat there for a while, listening to the rain and occasional rumble of thunder. The wipers squeaked across the windshield, fighting a losing battle against the downpour. I kept the engine running so we'd have some heat and light. "How long do you think this will last?" Audrey asked, peering out at the darkness beyond the foggy windows. I shrugged. "Who knows? Weather app says it could be a couple hours at least." She sighed and settled back in her seat. We made small talk for a bit, trying to ignore the claustrophobic feeling of being trapped in the car while the storm raged outside. After about 20 minutes, I noticed movement in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just rain streaking down the back window, playing tricks on my eyes. But then I saw it more clearly, a figure emerging from the darkness, stumbling towards our car. "Holy shit," I breathed. "Audrey, look." She twisted around in her seat and let out a small gasp. We watched as a woman staggered into view, completely drenched and barely staying on her feet as she fought against the wind and rain. She reached the passenger side and pounded on the window, yelling something we couldn't make out over the storm. Her face was ghostly pale in the glow of our taillights, dark hair plastered to her head. "Should we let her in?" Audrey asked uncertainly. I hesitated. Every horror movie I'd ever seen was screaming at me not to unlock the doors. But it was pouring rain, pitch black out there. We couldn't just leave her. "Yeah, I guess we have to," I said reluctantly. Audrey hit the window lock and cracked her door open. Immediately, rain and wind whipped into the car. "Get in, quick," she called to the woman. The stranger practically fell into the back seat, slamming the door behind her. For a moment, the only sound was her ragged breathing and water dripping off her clothes. Thank you," she finally managed between chattering teeth. "I didn't think anyone would stop." "Of course," I said, twisting around to look at her. "Are you okay? What happened?" She was shivering violently, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her thin frame. I couldn't tell if she was young or old. Her features seemed oddly blurred, like I was looking at her through frosted glass. "Car broke down," she mumbled. "Been walking for hours." "Jesus," Audrey said. "Here, let me find you a blanket or something." As Audrey rummaged around in the back seat, I asked the woman, "Where were you headed? We can drop you somewhere once the storm lets up." She didn't answer, just stared at me with an unnervingly blank expression. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the damp air seeping into the car. "Here," Audrey said, passing back an old fleece throw we kept for picnics. "It's not much, but—" The woman's hand shot out and grabbed Audrey's wrist. My girlfriend let out a yelp of pain and tried to pull away. "Hey!" I shouted. "Let go of her!" But the stranger was incredibly strong. She yanked Audrey towards the back seat, causing her to slam against the center console. I lunged over, trying to pry the woman's fingers off Audrey's arm. Her skin was ice-cold, clammy. As I struggled with her, she suddenly released Audrey and latched onto my throat instead. Her hands felt like frozen steel cables closing around my windpipe. I gasped and choked, clawing at her grip. But I couldn't break free. Black spots danced in my vision as I fought for air. Dimly, I heard Audrey screaming. There was a loud thunk, and suddenly the pressure on my throat released. I slumped back, coughing and gulping in desperate breaths. When my head stopped spinning, I saw Audrey wielding the heavy flashlight from the glove compartment. The woman was slumped against the door, a trickle of blood running down her forehead. "Get her out!" Audrey yelled. "Now!" I fumbled for the door handle and shoved it open. Wind and rain immediately buffeted us. Together, Audrey and I managed to heave the woman's limp form out onto the gravel. I slammed the door shut and Audrey hit the locks. We sat there panting, staring wide-eyed at each other. The woman lay motionless outside, rain pelting her prone form. "What the fuck?" I wheezed, gingerly touching my bruised throat. "What the actual fuck was that?" Audrey shook her head, eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know. Oh my God, I don't know. We need to get out of here." I nodded and turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't catch. "No, no, no," I muttered, trying again. Still nothing. "Shit! Try again," Audrey urged, glancing fearfully out the window. I took a deep breath and turned the key once more. This time the engine roared to life. I threw the car into drive and peeled out of the turnout, tires spinning on the wet gravel. As we fishtailed back onto the road, I caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror. The woman was standing up, staring after us. Even through the rain-streaked glass, I could see her eyes reflecting our taillights like a cat's. "Go, go, go!" Audrey yelled. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, heart pounding. The car hydroplaned slightly as we took a curve too fast, but I managed to keep it on the road. We drove in tense silence for several minutes, both of us constantly checking the mirrors. The adrenaline slowly started to fade, leaving me feeling shaky and nauseous. "Are you okay?" I asked Audrey. She nodded, rubbing her wrist where angry red marks were already forming. "Yeah, you." "I think so," I said hoarsely. My throat was killing me. What the hell was wrong with that woman? "I don't know," Audrey said. "But did you see how cold she was? It was like touching ice." I shuddered, remembering the clammy feel of the woman's skin. "Yeah, and her eyes. They looked weird, like glowing almost." We lapsed back into uneasy silence. The storm was finally starting to let up, the downpour reducing to a steady drizzle. I eased off the gas a little as visibility improved. That's when I saw her. Standing in the middle of the road about a quarter-mile ahead was a figure. Even at this distance, I recognized the bedraggled hair, the soaking wet clothes. "Oh my God," Audrey whispered. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching on the wet asphalt. We skidded to a stop about 50 yards from where the woman stood. She didn't move, didn't react at all to our approach, just stood there, staring at us with those eerily reflective eyes. How did she get here?" Audrey asked, voice trembling. "We left her miles back." I shook my head mutely, unable to process what I was seeing. It wasn't possible. And yet there she was. Slowly, deliberately, the woman raised one arm and pointed directly at us. A chill ran through my entire body. "Go around her," Audrey said urgently. "Just go around and keep driving." I nodded and carefully steered onto the shoulder, giving the figure a wide berth. As we passed, she pivoted to keep facing us, arms still outstretched. I pressed the gas, eager to put as much distance between us as possible. We drove for hours after that, not stopping until we were 2 counties over and the sun was peeking over the horizon. Neither of us wanted to be the first to bring up what had happened. It was too strange, too impossible to put into words. Even now, months later, I still have nightmares about those icy hands closing around my throat. Audrey and I don't talk about that night. We can't explain it, can't make sense of it. But sometimes when we're driving at night and it starts to rain, I catch her watching the rearview mirror nervously. And I know we're both scanning the roadside, praying we don't see a bedraggled figure emerging from the darkness, arm outstretched in silent accusation. I'd been driving for about 14 hours straight, hauling a load of electronics from Ohio to New Jersey. The monotony of the highway had long since faded into a blur of white lines and mile markers. My eyes were getting heavy, but I knew I had to push on to make my delivery deadline. Around 2 a.m., I turned off onto Route 6 to avoid some construction on the main highway. It was a rural, 2-lane road winding through thick forest. No streetlights, no houses, nothing but dense woods on either side. The darkness pressed in around my headlights like a physical thing. I hadn't seen another vehicle for miles when I came around a sharp bend and saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a line of what looked like truck tires stretched across both lanes of the road about 100 yards ahead. My first thought was that there must have been an accident or something fell off another truck. But then I saw the figures. 4 dark shapes emerged from the tree line and started moving towards the road. Even from that distance, something about their movements seemed off. They weren't running or even walking normally. It was more of a loping, animal-like gait. Every instinct in my body screamed danger. This was no accident. It was an ambush. My mind raced through the stories I'd heard from other truckers about hijackings, and worse on isolated stretches of road like this. I knew I had only seconds to decide what to do. I couldn't stop. If I did, those figures would be on me before I could get the truck turned around. There was no shoulder to speak of, just a steep drop-off on one side and dense forest on the other. The adrenaline coursing through me made time seem to slow down as I weighed my options in a split second. Without fully thinking it through, I yanked the wheel hard to the right. The massive truck lurched sickeningly as the tires left the pavement and plowed into the underbrush. Branches snapped against the windshield as I fought to keep control. The engine roared as I floored it, willing the rig to plow through the thick vegetation. I could see those dark shapes in my side mirrors now, moving with inhuman speed towards the back of the trailer. Their forms seemed to shimmer and distort in a way that made my eyes hurt to look at. I forced myself to focus ahead, knowing that one wrong move could send me tumbling down the hillside. The next few minutes were the most terrifying of my life. Alarms blared in the cab as I pushed the truck way beyond what it was meant to handle. The trailer fish-tailed wildly behind me, threatening to jackknife at any moment. But somehow I managed to keep it together, crashing through the woods parallel to the road. I don't know how far I went before I found a logging road that led back to the highway. By that point, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. I wanted nothing more than to pull over and call the police. But the primal fear that had gripped me wouldn't let me stop until I was miles away on a well-lit stretch of interstate. When I finally did pull into a rest stop, I was drenched in sweat and my legs could barely hold me up. I called the state police and tried to explain what had happened. But even as the words left my mouth, it all sounded insane. They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I believed it myself. I've gone over that night 1,000 times in my head, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just some idiots trying to rob trucks. But deep down, I know it was something much worse. Those weren't normal human movements, and the way they seemed to flicker and distort in my mirrors. It was like looking at something that shouldn't exist in our reality. I gave up long-haul trucking not long after that. Couldn't handle being alone on dark roads anymore. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like those things are right outside my window. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stopped that night, and honestly, I never want to find out. I've heard whispers from other drivers about similar experiences in that area. Stories of trucks found abandoned, drivers gone without a trace. Most folks write it off as urban legends, but I know the truth. There's something out there in those woods, something that hunts on lonely roads in the dead of night. And God help you if you find yourself in its path. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, most days I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw that night, and I know that I'll never set foot in those woods again as long as I live. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing by not reporting it more forcefully. Maybe I could have prevented someone else from going through what I did. But then I remember the sheer otherworldly terror of those things coming for me, and I know that no one would have believed me anyway. The worst part is not knowing what those things were or what they wanted, not knowing if they're still out there, waiting for their next victim. Every time I see a news story about a missing person or an abandoned vehicle in that part of Pennsylvania, my blood runs cold. I've tried to move on with my life, to forget about that night. But the memories are always there, lurking just below the surface. The sound of branches scraping against metal, the inhuman speed of those dark shapes, the sickening lurch as my truck left the road. Sometimes when I'm driving at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something moving in the trees by the roadside. It's probably just my imagination playing tricks on me. At least, that's what I tell myself. But there's always that moment of paralyzing fear, that certainty that they've found me again. I know this all sounds crazy. If someone had told me this story before it happened, I would have laughed it off. But once you've seen something like that, something that defies explanation, it changes you. You realize that the world is a much stranger and more terrifying place than you ever imagined. To anyone reading this who drives those lonely roads at night, be careful. Keep your doors locked and don't stop for anything. And if you see a line of tires across the road and dark shapes moving in the trees, don't hesitate. Just run. Run and don't look back. I count myself lucky to have escaped that night. But a part of me wonders if I truly got away, or if those things are still out there, biding their time, waiting for the day when I let my guard down and they can finish what they started on that dark stretch of Route 6. So that's my story. Take it for what you will. Maybe I'm just a guy who had a crazy hallucination from too many hours on the road. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the night I nearly became another vanished victim of whatever lurks in those Pennsylvania woods. I had been working there for about 6 months at that point. It was a pretty standard suburban supermarket, nothing fancy, but it paid the bills while I figured out what I wanted to do with my life after high school. Most days blended together in a haze of scanning items and making small talk with customers. But that day, something felt off right from the start. I noticed this guy in his 40s lingering near my checkout lane, even though there were other lanes open with shorter lines. He was average height, kind of pudgy, with thinning brown hair. Nothing remarkable about his appearance, but something in his eyes made me uneasy. When he finally came through my line, he barely had any items, just a few random things like a magazine and a candy bar. As I rang him up, he kept staring at me intently. I tried to brush it off, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" he said, his voice overly friendly. I mumbled some polite response, hoping he'd just pay and leave, but he kept talking. "You must be new here. I don't think I've seen you before," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I've been here a while actually," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. I didn't want to engage, but I also didn't want to be rude to a customer. "Really? Guess I just never noticed such a pretty face before," he said with a wink. I felt my skin crawl. I quickly finished the transaction and handed him his receipt, eager for him to leave. As he walked away, I could have sworn I saw him glance back at me. I tried to shake off the encounter and focus on my work. But over the next few hours, I kept seeing him out of the corner of my eye. He'd be browsing items nearby or accidentally bump into my lane again with just 1 or 2 items. Each time, he'd make some comment or ask a personal question. "Do you live nearby? What time do you usually get off work? Are you single?" I deflected as best I could, but I was starting to get seriously creeped out. I mentioned it to my coworker Jenny during my break, and she said she'd keep an eye out. But there wasn't much else we could do. He wasn't technically doing anything wrong, just being weirdly persistent. As my shift went on, his behavior escalated. He started hanging around my lane even when he wasn't buying anything, just watching me. At one point, I saw him talking to my manager and gesturing in my direction. My stomach dropped. Was he complaining about me? trying to get information. By the time my shift was ending, I was a nervous wreck. I kept looking over my shoulder, jumping at every noise. As I clocked out and headed for the employee exit, I had a sinking feeling in my gut. Sure enough, as soon as I stepped into the dim parking lot, I saw him. He was leaning against a car near the employee section, clearly waiting for me. My heart started racing. I turned to go back inside, but he called out, "Hey there, fancy seeing you here," he said, his voice sickly sweet. "Need a ride home? It's awful dark out." I shook my head, unable to speak. He started walking towards me. "Come on, don't be shy. A pretty girl like you shouldn't be out alone at night. Why don't you let me give you a lift?" He was getting closer, backing me up against the wall. Just then, I heard the door open behind me. It was my manager, Dave. "Everything okay out here?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. The creepy guy immediately backed off, mumbling some excuse. Dave put a protective arm around my shoulders and guided me back inside, shooting daggers at the man with his eyes. Once we were safely inside, I broke down crying. Dave called the police and had me give a statement. They took it seriously, but said there wasn't much they could do since the guy hadn't actually touched me or explicitly threatened me. I was shaken to my core. Dave offered to walk me to my car, and I gratefully accepted. As we walked out, I scanned the parking lot nervously, but the creepy guy was gone. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me jump. I kept replaying the events in my head, wondering if there were signs I had missed. Should I have spoken up sooner? What if Dave hadn't come out when he did? The next day I called in sick to work. I couldn't bear the thought of going back there, of possibly seeing that man again. Dave was understanding and told me to take as much time as I needed. But even staying home didn't feel safe. I kept thinking I saw movement outside my windows. Every time my phone buzzed, I worried it was him somehow. How much information had he gotten about me? After a few days, I knew I had to go back to work. I couldn't let fear control my life. But things were different now. I was constantly on edge, always looking over my shoulder. I asked to be moved to a different department, away from the checkout lanes. Weeks went by, and there was no sign of the creepy guy. But I never fully relaxed. Every time the door chimed, I tensed up. Every male customer in his 40s made my heart race, even if they looked nothing like him. It's been months now, and I still haven't seen him again. But the fear lingers. I find myself checking locks obsessively, avoiding being out alone at night. I'm jumpy and paranoid in a way I never was before. The worst part is the not knowing. Did he just give up and move on? Is he out there somewhere, watching and waiting? Will I ever feel truly safe again? I know logically that I'm probably fine, that it was just one creepy guy who hopefully got scared off. But the experience changed me. It opened my eyes to how vulnerable we can be, even in seemingly safe, everyday places. I'm trying to move on with my life, to not let this define me. But some days are harder than others. I still work at the supermarket, but I'm always aware of my surroundings in a way I never was before. I hope that by sharing my story, maybe it will help someone else recognize the warning signs or feel less alone if they've gone through something similar. And maybe, just maybe, it will help me process and heal from this traumatic experience that I still can't fully explain or understand. As I entered the store, the harsh fluorescent lighting made me squint. The place was eerily quiet, with just the low hum of refrigerators and occasional beeping from the registers up front. I grabbed a basket and started making my way down the aisles, consulting my short shopping list. I was in the cereal aisle when I first noticed him. An elderly man, probably in his 70s, with wispy white hair and thick glasses. He gave me a friendly nod as he shuffled past, leaning heavily on his cart. I smiled politely in return, thinking nothing of it. A few minutes later, I was examining the pasta options when I got that prickly feeling of being watched. I glanced up to see the same old man at the end of the aisle, staring intently in my direction. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away and pretended to be engrossed in reading a box of lasagna noodles. I shrugged it off and continued shopping, but I kept noticing him pop up in nearly every aisle I went down. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe we just happened to need a lot of the same items. But as it kept happening, a sense of unease began to creep over me. In the produce section, I was selecting some apples when I felt someone come up close behind me. Too close. I turned to find the old man standing there, mere inches away, staring at me with an unsettling intensity. "Lovely evening for shopping, isn't it?" he said in a raspy voice. I took an instinctive step back. Yeah, I guess so." He took a step closer, maintaining that uncomfortably small distance between us. "I always enjoy coming to the store late at night. So peaceful, so intimate." The way he said that last word sent a shiver down my spine. I mumbled something about needing to hurry and quickly moved away, my heart starting to race. As I speed-walked to the next aisle, I glanced back to see him slowly following, pushing his near-empty cart. At this point, I was seriously creeped out and just wanted to finish my shopping as fast as possible. I practically jogged through the remaining aisles, grabbing items and tossing them in my basket without much thought. But every time I looked around, there he was, always maintaining some distance but clearly trailing me. I made my way to the checkout, hands shaking slightly as I unloaded my basket. To my horror, I saw the old man get in line right behind me. As the cashier rang up my items, he stood way too close, practically breathing down my neck. I could feel his eyes boring into me. "Did you find everything you needed tonight, miss?" he asked in that creaky voice. I nodded tersely, avoiding eye contact as I hurriedly paid and gathered my bags. As I speed-walked towards the exit, I heard him call out behind me, "Drive safely now. I'd hate for anything to happen to you." I practically ran to my car, fumbling with my keys as I unlocked it and dove inside. I locked the doors immediately and sat there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. In my rearview mirror, I saw the old man exit the store and slowly make his way to a beat-up station wagon. He took his time loading his few bags, all while staring in the direction of my car. I started the engine and got out of there as fast as I could. The whole drive home, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see headlights following me. By the time I got to my apartment, I was a nervous wreck. I rushed inside, locked and deadbolted the door, and sank onto my couch feeling drained. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. Maybe the guy was just lonely and socially awkward. Maybe I was reading too much into things. But I couldn't shake that feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. After a little while, I started to calm down. I put away my groceries and decided to take a hot shower to relax. As I was toweling off afterwards, I heard my phone chime with a new text message. Figuring it was probably my mom or a friend, I picked it up to check. My blood ran cold as I read the message from an unknown number. "Hope you made it home safely. Those green apples you bought looked delicious. Sweet dreams." I felt like I was going to be sick. How did he get my number? I never gave it to him, or even spoke to him beyond those few terse words. My mind raced, trying to figure out how this was possible. Did he somehow hack the store's systems? Bribe an employee? I had no idea, and that terrified me even more. With shaking hands, I blocked the number and deleted the message. But the damage was done. My sense of safety and privacy had been completely shattered. I spent the rest of the night pacing anxiously around my apartment, jumping at every little sound. I double and triple checked that all the windows and doors were locked. Sleep was out of the question. I sat up all night with all the lights on, clutching my phone and debating whether to call the police. But what would I even tell them? That a creepy old guy followed me around a store and somehow got my number? I had no proof of anything illegal. As the sun finally began to rise, I was exhausted but still on high alert. I called in sick to work, not feeling up to leaving my apartment. I spent the day researching how to protect my personal information, changing passwords, and looking into home security systems. It's been a few days now, and nothing else has happened. No more texts or signs of the old man. But I still feel on edge constantly. I'm jumpy and paranoid, always looking over my shoulder when I go out. I haven't been back to that grocery store and don't know if I ever will. I keep wondering, was this just a one-time thing? Or is he out there somewhere, watching and waiting? The not knowing is almost worse than anything else. How much does he know about me? What were his intentions? I'm sharing this as a warning to others, especially women shopping alone at night. Trust your instincts if someone is making you uncomfortable. And be careful about your personal information. You never know who might be trying to access it or how. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again after this experience. That one creepy encounter has completely upended my sense of security. I'm left feeling violated and vulnerable, all because of a routine trip to buy groceries. I just hope that by sharing this, I can help someone else avoid going through the same thing. I was just trying to do my usual Saturday grocery shopping when everything went sideways. Looking back, I should have trusted my gut feeling from the start, but I guess I was trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. It was around 3 p.m. when I got to the supermarket. The place was packed, as you'd expect on a weekend afternoon. I grabbed a cart and started making my way through the produce section, checking items off my list. That's when I first noticed him, a tall guy in his 40s wearing a dark jacket. He caught my eye because he seemed to be staring in my direction, but I brushed it off. People watching is normal in crowded places, right? I moved on to the dairy aisle, and as I was comparing yogurt prices, I got that prickly feeling on the back of my neck. I glanced up and there he was again, at the end of the aisle, pretending to look at cheese. Our eyes met for a split second before he quickly looked away. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself I was imagining things. Over the next 20 minutes, my unease grew as I realized this guy kept popping up wherever I went. Cereal aisle? There he was, lingering by the Cheerios. Cleaning products? Yep, suddenly very interested in dish soap. Each time I spotted him, he was a little closer than before. I started to feel trapped. My hands were shaking as I grabbed items off the shelves, barely paying attention to what I was putting in my cart. I just wanted to finish and get out of there. But every time I looked up, there he was, always maintaining enough distance to have plausible deniability, but unmistakably tracking my movements. My heart was racing. I abandoned my cart and speed-walked to the restroom, locking myself in a stall. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to calm down and convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was all a coincidence. Maybe I was seeing patterns that weren't there. Taking a deep breath, I left the restroom and immediately saw him standing near the pharmacy counter, pretending to read a magazine. But his eyes flicked up to me the second I emerged. That's when I knew for certain. This was real. This man was stalking me through the store. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Should I confront him? Call for help? Try to lose him in the aisles? Make a run for it? My mind was spinning with horrible scenarios of what might happen if I didn't get away from this creep. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone, ready to call 911. But then I spotted a young guy restocking shelves nearby and practically ran over to him. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. "There's a man who's been following me around the store. I'm really scared. Can you please help me?" The employee looked concerned and asked me to point out the man. When I discreetly indicated the guy in the dark jacket, the worker's expression changed to recognition. "Ma'am, please come with me to the manager's office," he said quietly. "We've had issues with this individual before." As we walked briskly to the back of the store, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The stalker had vanished. I felt sick to my stomach. In the office, I gave a statement to the manager while he reviewed security footage. They confirmed the man had indeed been tailing me methodically through the store. Apparently, he was a known problem. They'd received similar complaints before, but he always left before they could confront him. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, the man was long gone. I gave them my statement, but I knew the chances of catching him were slim. They took down his description and said they'd increase patrols in the area, but it felt like cold comfort. I was a mess by the time I got home. I spent the rest of the day obsessively checking my locks and peeking out the windows. That night, every little sound made me jump. I barely slept. It's been a few weeks now, and I still feel on edge every time I leave the house. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning faces in crowds. I've started varying my routines, taking different routes to work, shopping at odd hours. The rational part of my brain knows the chances of seeing that man again are slim, but I can't shake the feeling of vulnerability. That afternoon shattered my sense of safety. I keep replaying it in my head, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't asked for help when I did. I try to tell myself that I'm okay, that it's over. But deep down, I know I'll never feel quite as secure in public spaces as I did before. That man may be gone, but the fear he instilled lingers on. Every time I step into a store now, I can't help but wonder, is someone watching me? The store was eerily quiet when I walked in, with just a couple of other shoppers and one bored-looking cashier. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I grabbed a basket and started making my way down the aisles. I was tired and just wanted to get what I needed and go home. I had only been there for a few minutes when I first noticed him. A disheveled-looking man in his 40s or 50s, wearing a stained t-shirt and ratty jeans. He caught my eye because he was muttering to himself and pacing back and forth at the end of the cereal aisle. I tried not to stare, but something about his demeanor immediately put me on edge. I quickly grabbed some milk and bread, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my stomach. But as I turned down the next aisle, I realized the man had moved and was now standing at the other end, staring directly at me with an unnervingly intense gaze. My heart started to race as I hurried past, keeping my eyes down. For the next several minutes, everywhere I went in the store, he seemed to appear. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just coincidence, but soon it became undeniable that he was following me. He never came too close, but was always lurking nearby, mumbling incoherently and fixing me with that same wild-eyed stare. I started to panic, looking around desperately for an employee or security guard. But the few other people in the store seemed oblivious to what was happening. I considered abandoning my shopping and just running out, but I was afraid that might provoke him to chase me. So I tried to stay calm and act normal while quickly grabbing the last few items I needed. But inside, I was terrified. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, there he was. At one point, I distinctly heard him say, "Pretty lady," in a low, menacing tone that made my skin crawl. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore and practically ran to the checkout. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get my wallet out. The cashier seemed to sense something was wrong and asked if I was okay. I just nodded, not wanting to cause a scene. But as I was paying, I saw the man hovering by the store exit, waiting for me. Tears of fear started to well up in my eyes. The cashier must have noticed because she asked again if I needed help. In a shaky whisper, I told her about the man following me and asked if there was security who could escort me to my car. She looked concerned and said she'd call the manager. But just then, the man suddenly turned and walked out of the store. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking maybe he had given up. The cashier offered to watch as I went to my car, so I gratefully accepted and hurried out to the parking lot. It was dark outside, with just a few flickering lights illuminating the nearly empty lot. I power-walked to my car, fumbling for my keys. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around and there he was, only about 10 feet away and closing in fast. Pure terror seized me. I ran the last few steps to my car and frantically tried to unlock it. But in my panic, I dropped my keys. As I bent to grab them, I could sense him getting closer. Finally, I managed to get the door open and dove inside, slamming it shut and locking it just as his face appeared in the window. He started pounding on the glass, screaming incoherently. I was sobbing hysterically at this point as I jammed my key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I slammed it into reverse, nearly hitting another car as I peeled out of the space. As I sped away, I could see him in my rearview mirror, still yelling and now running after my car. I drove way over the speed limit all the way home, constantly checking to make sure I wasn't being followed. When I finally got to my apartment, I sat in my car shaking for a good 15 minutes before I felt safe enough to go inside. I double and triple checked all my locks that night. I barely slept, jumping at every little sound. It's been weeks, but I still have nightmares about that man's crazed face in my car window. I can't bring myself to go grocery shopping alone anymore, especially at night. That experience shattered my sense of safety and made me realize how vulnerable we can be, even in seemingly mundane public spaces. I've replayed it over and over, wondering if I should have done something differently or if there were warning signs I missed. But ultimately, I know it wasn't my fault. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, crossing paths with someone who clearly wasn't in their right mind. I'm sharing this as a reminder to always trust your instincts and be aware of your surroundings. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. Don't be afraid to ask for help if you feel unsafe. I'm grateful nothing worse happened, but the fear and trauma from that night will stay with me for a long time. I still get anxious in stores sometimes, especially if I notice anyone behaving strangely. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder and planning escape routes. It's exhausting to live with that kind of hypervigilance, but I don't know how to shake it. I've considered talking to a therapist about the lingering anxiety and PTSD-like symptoms, but part of me is afraid that reliving it will just make things worse. For now, I'm trying to take it day by day and slowly regain my confidence in public spaces. I know rationally that the chances of something like that happening again are slim. But it's hard to silence that voice of fear once it takes hold. I'm working on finding a balance between being cautious and not letting this experience control my life. If anyone else has gone through something similar, I'd love to hear how you coped with it. And please, please be careful out there. You never know when a routine errand could turn into a nightmare. It was around 11 p.m., and I was exhausted after a long shift. I had one last delivery to make before I could call it a night. Some late-night munchies for a house way out in the sticks near Millbrook. I wasn't thrilled about driving out there so late, but the pay was good, and I figured it would be a quick drop-off. As I wound my way down the dark, narrow roads leading out of town, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. The trees seemed to close in on either side, creating an endless tunnel of shadows. My headlights barely penetrated the inky blackness ahead. I turned up the radio, trying to distract myself from the eerie silence outside. I was about 10 minutes away from the delivery address when I first noticed the car behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just another local heading home. But as the minutes ticked by and the car maintained the same distance, that niggling sense of unease grew stronger. I took a sharp right turn onto a smaller side road, and the car followed. My heart rate picked up. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the alarm bells going off in my head. I sped up a little, hoping to put some distance between us. The car sped up too. Now I was really starting to freak out. I white-knuckled the steering wheel, constantly checking my rearview mirror. The car stayed right on my tail, close enough that I could see the silhouette of the driver, but not make out any details. I fumbled for my phone, thinking I should call 911, but of course there was no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. Panic started to set in as I realized how utterly alone and vulnerable I was. Suddenly, the car behind me revved its engine and started to close the gap. My adrenaline spiked as I realized this was no coincidence. They were deliberately chasing me. I floored the gas pedal, my old Honda protesting as I pushed it to its limits. The road ahead curved sharply, and I took the turn way too fast, nearly losing control. I had no idea where I was going anymore. All thoughts of the delivery were long gone. My only focus was escape. I blindly took turn after turn down progressively narrower dirt roads, praying I wouldn't hit a dead end. The pursuer was relentless, keeping pace no matter how erratically I drove. At one point, they pulled up alongside me and I caught a glimpse of a dark figure in a baseball cap. I couldn't make out their face, but the malevolent energy radiating from that car made my blood run cold. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, my pursuer suddenly accelerated and cut in front of me, forcing me to slam on the brakes. We were on a tight dirt path with thick forest on both sides. There was nowhere for me to go. I was trapped. My mind raced frantically, searching for a way out. The other car's engine was still running, but they made no move to get out. Were they toying with me? What did they want? In that moment of paralyzing fear, some instinct for survival kicked in. I threw my car into reverse and gunned it backwards, not caring about the scratches and dents I was surely adding to my already beat-up vehicle. I managed to turn around in a rushed three-point turn and took off back the way we'd come. My pursuer was caught off guard by my sudden maneuver. By the time they got turned around, I had a decent head start. I drove like a maniac, taking turns at breakneck speed, constantly checking my mirrors for those haunting headlights. I have no idea how long I drove or how far. Eventually, blessedly, I saw lights in the distance. I'd made it back to civilization. As soon as I hit the main road, I floored it straight to the police station, finally feeling safe enough to pull over once I screeched into the parking lot. I burst into the station, wild-eyed and babbling. The officers on duty were alarmed by my state and tried to calm me down enough to give a coherent statement. I told them everything, but without any real evidence beyond my frantic testimony, there wasn't much they could do. They took my information and said they'd look into it, but I could tell they were skeptical. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those menacing headlights in my rearview mirror. I kept replaying the chase in my mind, second-guessing every decision I made. Should I have tried to confront them? Should I have driven somewhere else? The what-ifs were driving me crazy. It's been a few days now, and I still haven't been able to bring myself to do any more deliveries. The thought of driving down those dark country roads again makes me break out in a cold sweat. I can't stop wondering who was in that car and what they wanted with me. Was it just some sick person getting their kicks by terrifying strangers? Or something more sinister? I know I need to get back to work soon. Bills don't pay themselves. But every time I think about getting behind the wheel, especially at night, I'm gripped by this paralyzing fear. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that car again. I've lived in this area my whole life, but now every shadow seems menacing. I used to love the peace and quiet of country living, but now the isolation feels suffocating. I'm jumping at every little noise, convinced that whoever was in that car is still out there, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe on those roads again. The rational part of my brain tells me it was probably just a one-time thing, a random act of cruelty by some bored local. But another part of me can't shake the feeling that this isn't over, that someday, when I least expect it, I'll look in my rearview mirror and see those headlights again. I'm writing this partly as a warning to other drivers out there, especially those doing late-night deliveries in rural areas. Always trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. And please, be careful out there. You never know what kind of monsters might be lurking on those dark, lonely roads. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night or why I was targeted. All I know is that the experience has changed me forever. I used to love the freedom of the open road, but now every drive feels like a potential trap. I'm constantly on edge, always watching, always waiting for those headlights to appear again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress and fatigue of long nights on the road finally got to me and made me hallucinate. But then I look at the scrapes and dents on my car from that frantic escape, and I know it was all too real. I've tried talking to friends and family about it, but they all tell me I'm overreacting, that I should just forget about it and move on. But how can I forget the most terrifying night of my life? How can I just brush off the fact that someone out there wanted to hurt me for reasons I'll never understand? I've started seeing a therapist to try and work through the trauma. She's helping me develop coping strategies for the anxiety and panic attacks that have become a regular part of my life since that night. But progress is slow. Every time I think I'm starting to feel better, something will trigger the memories, and I'm right back in that moment of pure terror. I've been thinking about moving away, starting fresh somewhere new, but part of me is afraid that no matter where I go, I'll never truly feel safe again. That fear will always be there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to rear its ugly head. For now, I'm taking it one day at a time. I've switched to day shifts only, and I stick to well-lit, populated areas. I know I can't live in fear forever, but right now, it's the only way I can function. To whoever was in that car that night, I don't know who you are or what you wanted, but you've changed my life forever. You've taken away my sense of security, my peace of mind. I hope that whatever sick thrill you got from terrorizing me was worth it, and I hope that someday, somehow, you'll face consequences for what you've done. To anyone reading this who's experienced something similar, you're not alone. What happened to you was real, and your feelings are valid. Don't let anyone dismiss your trauma or tell you to just get over it. Healing takes time, and it's okay to not be okay. And to all the late-night drivers out there, especially those venturing into isolated areas, please be careful. Always let someone know where you're going and when you expect to be back. Trust your instincts, and if you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, don't hesitate to call for help. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what happened that night on those dark country roads near Millbrook, but I'm trying, and I hope that by sharing my story, I can help others stay safe and maybe, just maybe, prevent someone else from going through the same terrifying ordeal. Stay safe out there, everyone, and always, always watch your rearview mirror. It was around 10 p.m. when I got the ping for a delivery to the outskirts of town. The address seemed a bit off, 6666 Willow Lane. I'd never heard of that street before, but the GPS said it was only about 15 minutes away, so I figured why not. The payout was pretty good too. As I drove further out of town, the streetlights became fewer and farther between. The road got narrower and bumpier, winding through dense woods. I started to get an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Where the hell was this place? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a rusty old mailbox with the number 6666. I pulled into a long, overgrown driveway that led to a dilapidated Victorian house. The place looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. Paint was peeling off the walls, shutters were hanging crooked, and vines were growing up the sides. The only sign of life was a single dim yellow bulb flickering on the porch. Every instinct told me to turn around and get the hell out of there. But I needed the money, and I didn't want to mess up my rating on the app. So I grabbed the food bag and cautiously made my way up to the porch. As I got closer, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine. I called out, "Hello, Uber Eats delivery," but got no response. The silence was deafening. My hands were shaking as I set the food down on the welcome mat. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable creak of floorboards inside the house. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving towards the door. I don't know what possessed me to look inside, but I found myself peering through the crack in the door. The entryway was pitch black, except for a sliver of moonlight coming through a grimy window. And there, illuminated in that faint glow, was a coat rack with a single pristine black overcoat hanging on it. It looked brand new, completely out of place in the decrepit house. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something even stranger. The coat was swaying ever so slightly, as if someone had just brushed past it. But there was no one there. My heart was pounding in my chest. I needed to get out of there now. I turned to sprint back to my car, but something made me look back one last time. The door was wide open, and there, silhouetted in the doorway, was a tall, impossibly thin figure. I couldn't make out any features. It was like a black void in the shape of a person, but I could feel it staring right at me. I've never run so fast in my life. I peeled out of that driveway, tires squealing, and didn't slow down until I was back in town. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. When I finally calmed down enough to check my phone, my blood ran cold. The delivery had been canceled. There was no record of it ever existing in my app. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild. Maybe I was more sleep-deprived than I realized. But deep down, I knew what I saw was real. I haven't been able to shake the feeling of being watched ever since. Sometimes when I'm driving at night, I swear I see that impossibly thin figure in my rearview mirror. And every time I close my eyes, I see that pristine black coat swaying in an invisible breeze. I don't know what happened in that house on Willow Lane. Part of me never wants to find out, but another part of me is drawn back there, desperate for answers. All I know is I'll never look at late-night deliveries the same way again. Has anyone else had a similar experience? Am I going crazy? I need to know I'm not alone in this. Please, if you've seen anything like this, let me know. I can't stop thinking about it, and I'm scared to be alone in the dark now. I've been doing some research on the history of Shadow Creek, trying to find any information about that house or Willow Lane. But it's like they don't exist. I can't find any record of that address, and none of the town maps show a Willow Lane anywhere near where I was that night. The weirdest part? I tried to go back there in the daylight a few days later, just to prove to myself it was all in my head, but I couldn't find it. I drove up and down that road for hours, but there was no turnoff, no driveway, no creepy old house. It's like it vanished into thin air. I'm starting to question everything now. Was any of it real? Did I hallucinate the whole thing? But it felt so vivid, so terrifying. I can still hear those slow, creaking footsteps in my nightmares. I've been jumpy ever since, always looking over my shoulder. Every time I get a ping for a delivery to an unfamiliar address, my heart starts racing. I've been turning down any orders that take me out of the main part of town after dark. My girlfriend says I'm being paranoid, that I should just forget about it and move on. But how can I when I feel like I'm being watched all the time? When I catch glimpses of that impossibly thin figure out of the corner of my eye? I'm thinking about quitting the delivery gig altogether. It's not worth the risk of encountering whatever that was again. But part of me is afraid that if I stop, it'll find another way to reach me. Like it's not finished with me yet. I've been having these vivid dreams lately. I'm back in that house, wandering through endless dark corridors. I can hear whispers coming from behind closed doors, but I can never make out what they're saying. And always, there's the sound of footsteps following me, getting closer and closer, no matter how fast I run. I wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. Sometimes I swear I can still smell the musty, decaying scent of that old house lingering in my bedroom. I've started leaving the lights on at night. I can't stand the darkness anymore. It feels like it's hiding something, waiting to reach out and grab me when I least expect it. I know this all sounds crazy. Trust me, I feel crazy just writing it out, but I need to get it off my chest. I need to know if anyone else has experienced anything like this. Has anyone else encountered the house on Willow Lane? Or seen the figure in black? Please, if you have any information, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, let me know. I'm desperate for answers. I can't go on living like this, jumping at every shadow and questioning my own sanity. I just want my life back. I want to be able to sleep through the night without waking up screaming. I want to be able to do my job without having a panic attack every time I get an order for the outskirts of town. But most of all, I want to know what happened that night. Was it all in my head? Or is there something out there, something beyond our understanding that's taken an interest in me? I don't know if I'll ever get the answers I'm looking for. But I do know one thing for certain. I'll never forget that night on Willow Lane, and the terror I felt standing on that rotting porch, staring into the abyss that stared right back at me. If you've read this far, thank you. Even if you think I'm completely insane, it helps just to get this off my chest. And if you've had a similar experience, well, I guess misery loves company. Stay safe out there, especially on those late-night deliveries. You never know what might be waiting for you in the shadows. Been doing this gig for a few months now. You know, one of those food delivery apps where you pick up orders and drop them off. It was around 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I got pinged for a delivery to Riverside. I'd been there a few times before, nothing special, just your typical old apartment complex on the outskirts of town. When I pulled up, something felt off right away. The place was dead quiet, which was strange even for that time of night. Usually you'd hear a TV or music coming from somewhere, but there was just nothing, and the lighting in the courtyard seemed dimmer than usual, casting weird shadows. I grabbed the order, just a single bag from that 24-hour diner down the street, and headed for Building 3. As I walked through the courtyard, I kept getting this prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. But every time I looked around, there was no one there. The bag said it was for apartment 304, so I took the stairs up to the 3rd floor. That's when things started getting really creepy. As I reached the landing, I noticed that a lot of the apartment doors were slightly ajar, just cracked open an inch or two. It struck me as super weird, but I figured maybe the building was having AC issues or something, and people were trying to get some airflow. I made my way down the hall, and I swear the temperature dropped like 10 degrees. My breath was actually visible in front of me. In August. What the hell? When I got to 304, the door was closed. I knocked and waited, but there was no answer. I was about to knock again when I heard a soft, "Come in," from inside. The voice sounded off somehow, kinda muffled and distant. I hesitated for a second, but then figured, what the hell? They said to come in, right? I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The apartment was pitch black inside. I'm talking couldn't see my hand in front of my face, dark. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, but for some reason it wouldn't turn on. Dead battery, maybe? Weird, since it had been nearly full when I arrived. I've got your delivery from Joe's Diner," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Still nothing. At this point, every instinct was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But I had a job to finish, you know? So I took a deep breath, stepped inside, and set the bag down on what felt like a small table just inside the door. As soon as I let go of the bag, the door slammed shut behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. "I'm just going to leave your food here, okay?" That's when I heard it. Footsteps coming from deeper in the apartment. But they sounded wrong, like they were slightly out of sync, or maybe coming from multiple directions at once. I backed up against the door, fumbling for the handle. Just as my hand found it, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A door, maybe to a bedroom or bathroom, slowly creaked open. I caught a glimpse of something in the darkness beyond, but my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was like a void, darker than the darkness around it, shifting and writhing. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I yanked the door open and bolted out of there so fast I nearly fell down the stairs. As I ran, I could have sworn I heard laughter echoing from multiple apartments. When I got back outside, I was drenched in sweat and shaking like a leaf. I practically dove into my car and locked the doors. It took me a few tries to get the key in the ignition because my hands were trembling so bad. As I was about to peel out of there, I remembered I needed to mark the delivery as complete in the app. I grabbed my phone and, what the hell? It was working fine now, full battery and everything. But when I opened the app, there was no record of the delivery I'd just made. It was like it had never existed. I sat there for a minute trying to process what was happening. Had I imagined the whole thing? No way. The bag of food was gone, so I must have delivered it somewhere. Against my better judgment, I decided to go back and check. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I just needed to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. I made my way back to the 3rd floor, heart in my throat the whole time. But when I got there, everything was normal. All the doors were closed. The temperature was fine. Apartment 304 looked just like all the others. I knocked, and after a moment an older woman answered. She looked confused when I asked about the delivery. "I'm sorry, young man, but I didn't order any food tonight," she said. I apologized for the mistake and practically ran back to my car. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I gone to the wrong apartment initially? But that didn't explain the weirdness with my phone, or the doors being open, or any of it really. Finally, I decided to call it a night and head home. As I was pulling out of the parking lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw dozens of faces pressed against the windows of the apartments, watching me leave. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. It's been a few weeks now, and I still can't explain what happened that night. I've done more deliveries to Riverside since then, and everything's been totally normal. But I can't shake the feeling that something seriously messed up went down in that place. I've tried researching the history of the building, looking for any stories of weird occurrences there, but I haven't found much. Just a few vague rumors about strange noises and people feeling uneasy. Part of me wants to go back to apartment 304 during the day and talk to that woman again, see if she remembers me or if she's experienced anything odd. But honestly, I'm too freaked out. I don't know if I imagined it all or if I somehow slipped into some kind of, I don't know, alternate reality or something for a little while. All I know is I'll never forget that night as long as I live. And these days, I always double-check the apartment number before I start a delivery at Riverside, just in case. It was a Friday evening, and I had one last package to drop off before calling it a day. The address was for a mansion in Oakwood Estates, one of those super exclusive neighborhoods where all the rich people live. As I pulled up to the security gate, I could already tell this place was on another level. Perfectly manicured lawns, luxury cars in every driveway, the works. The guard at the gate barely glanced at my delivery uniform before waving me through. I drove slowly down the winding streets, taking in the massive houses. Finally, I arrived at my destination, a sprawling 3-story mansion with pillars out front and a circular driveway. I grabbed the small package from my van and walked up to the ornate front door. Before I could even ring the bell, the door swung open. A tall, thin man with slicked-back gray hair stood there, grinning widely at me. "Ah, you're here. I've been expecting you," he said in an oddly cheerful tone. "Please come in." Something about his demeanor immediately set me on edge. His smile seemed plastered on, not quite reaching his eyes, and the way he was looking at me, it was almost predatory. "Oh, that's okay, sir. I just need a signature for this package," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. His grin faltered for a split second before returning even wider than before. "Nonsense. I insist you come in for a moment. I have a special tip for you." He reached out and grabbed my arm, tugging me towards the doorway. I instinctively pulled back, alarm bells blaring in my head. "I'm sorry, but company policy says I can't enter customer homes," I said firmly, extricating myself from his grip. "I really just need a signature, then I'll be on my way." The man's face darkened, all pretense of cheerfulness evaporating. "You're making a mistake," he said in a low voice. "You'll regret not accepting my hospitality." A chill ran down my spine. I thrust the signature pad at him. "Sir, please just sign so I can finish my route." He glared at me for a long moment before snatching the pad and scribbling his name. I quickly handed over the package and practically ran back to my van, the man's eyes boring into my back the whole time. As I drove away, I let out a shaky breath. What a creep. I was glad to be out of there. Little did I know, my ordeal was just beginning. About 10 minutes later, as I was leaving the gated community, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I glanced at the message. "You should have come inside. Now I'll have to come find you." My blood ran cold. It had to be that guy from the mansion. How did he get my number? I tried to push it out of my mind. Probably just an empty threat to scare me. But then another text came through. Different number. "I know where you work. I know your route. You can't hide from me." My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some sick joke. Over the next hour, as I finished up my deliveries, the messages kept coming, always from new numbers. "I'm going to enjoy making you suffer. You'll wish you had just come inside when I asked nicely. I can smell your fear. It's intoxicating." With each new text, panic clawed at my chest. I wanted to call the police, but what could I tell them? Some creepy rich guy was sending me threatening texts. I had no proof it was him. And guys like that, they have connections. Who would believe me over him? By the time I got home that night, I was a nervous wreck. I triple-checked all my doors, and windows were locked. Sleep was out of the question. Every car that drove by, every creak in the house, I was convinced it was him coming for me. The texts continued sporadically over the next few days. Sometimes hours would pass with nothing. Just when I started to relax, my phone would buzz again. "Soon. I'm getting closer. I can see you." I was jumping at shadows, convinced he was stalking me. I called out sick from work, too terrified to do my usual route. What if he was waiting for me at one of my stops? After a week of this psychological torture, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the police, showing them the messages. They took a report, but didn't seem too concerned. Said there wasn't much they could do since no actual crime had been committed. They advised me to block the numbers and get a new phone. But even with a new number, the texts found me. It was like he could read my mind, always one step ahead. "Did you really think you could hide from me?" I'm disappointed. I expected more of a challenge. I was losing my mind. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every knock at the door sent me into a panic attack. I became a prisoner in my own home, too scared to leave. It's been a month now since that fateful delivery. The texts have mostly stopped, but the damage is done. I'm a shell of who I used to be. I've quit my job, moved to a new city, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. I don't know what that man wanted from me that day, what sinister plans he had in mind if I had gone into his house. But the not knowing is almost worse than anything I can imagine. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been better to just go inside that mansion. At least then it would be over. Instead, I'm left living in constant fear. never knowing if today will be the day he finally finds me. So let this be a warning to all you delivery drivers out there. Trust your gut. Don't take unnecessary risks. And for the love of God, never enter a customer's home. You never know what kind of monster might be waiting inside. I've been driving trucks for over a decade now, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing could have prepared me for that night in the Nevada desert. It was a moonless night, pitch black except for my headlights cutting through the darkness. I'd been driving for hours, hauling a load of electronics from California to Denver. The desert stretched endlessly on either side of the empty highway. Around 2 a.m., my truck started making a weird rattling noise. I tried to ignore it at first, hoping it was just my imagination. But after a few more miles, I knew something was wrong. The engine started sputtering, and I barely managed to pull over onto the shoulder before it died completely. I sat there for a moment, cursing my luck. Of course, this would happen in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out to take a look under the hood. The night was eerily silent except for the occasional gust of wind. As I popped the hood, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. I breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe it was another trucker who could help, or at least let me use their phone. The vehicle slowed to a stop behind my truck. It was an old, beat-up pickup truck that had definitely seen better days. A man got out and started walking towards me. Even in the dim light, I could tell something was off about him. He was rail-thin, almost skeletal, wearing dirty, tattered clothes that hung off his frame. His face was gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. "Having some trouble there, friend?" he called out in a raspy voice. I nodded, trying to keep my unease from showing. "Yeah, engine trouble. You wouldn't happen to have a phone I could use, would you?" He shook his head, grinning to reveal yellowed teeth. "No phone, but I'm pretty handy with engines. Mind if I take a look?" Every instinct was screaming at me to say no, but I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. "Sure, thanks," I said, stepping back from the engine. As he leaned in to look, I caught a whiff of something foul, like rotting meat. I had to fight the urge to gag. Looks like your alternator might be shot," he muttered. "I think I've got some tools in my truck that could help. Why don't you come take a look?" Warning bells were going off in my head. There was no way I was going anywhere near his vehicle. "That's all right," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've got my own tools. I'll just give it another try myself." His demeanor changed in an instant. The fake friendliness vanished, replaced by something cold and predatory. He straightened up and turned to face me, blocking my path back to the cab. Now, he said, his voice low and menacing. "That's not very neighborly of you. Here I am, offering to help, and you're being so rude." He took a step towards me, and I instinctively backed up. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "Look, I appreciate the offer, but I'm fine on my own," I said, trying to edge around him. He moved faster than I would have thought possible, cutting off my escape. "I don't think you understand," he snarled. "You don't have a choice here." That's when I saw the glint of metal in his hand, a large hunting knife. Terror flooded through me as I realized how much danger I was in. I was alone on a deserted highway with a madman, miles from help. I frantically looked around for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing within reach. The man took another step forward, raising the knife. "Please," I begged, my voice shaking. "I have a family. Just take whatever you want and go." He laughed, a chilling sound that made my blood run cold. "Oh, I intend to take what I want, and what I want is you." I knew in that moment that if I didn't do something, I was going to die out here in the desert. As he lunged forward, I threw myself to the side, narrowly avoiding the blade. I scrambled to my feet and started running towards the back of my truck, hoping to circle around to the passenger side and lock myself in the cab. But he was faster than I expected. I felt a hand grab the back of my shirt, yanking me off balance. I hit the ground hard, knocking the wind out of me. As I gasped for air, he loomed over me, knife raised. Just then, a miracle happened. Headlights appeared in the distance, growing rapidly brighter. The sound of an engine roaring broke the silence of the night. The man hesitated, looking from me to the approaching vehicle. I seized the opportunity and kicked out hard, catching him in the knee. He stumbled back with a cry of pain, and I scrambled to my feet again. The other vehicle, another semi-truck, was almost upon us now. I waved my arms frantically, yelling for help. My attacker took one last look at me, then turned and ran back to his pickup. He peeled out, tires kicking up gravel as he sped off into the night. The other truck pulled over, and a burly man jumped out. "You all right, buddy?" he called out. "I saw someone running off. Everything okay?" I was shaking so hard I could barely speak. I managed to stammer out what had happened as the other driver listened with wide eyes. "Jesus Christ," he muttered when I finished. "You're lucky I came along when I did. Here, let me take a look at your engine. I've got some tools that might help." It turned out to be a relatively simple fix, a loose connection that he was able to tighten up in a few minutes. As grateful as I was still too shaken to feel much relief. The other driver offered to follow me to the next town to make sure I got there safely. I gladly accepted, not wanting to be alone on that highway for another second. As we drove, I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind. The man's cold, predatory eyes, the glint of the knife, how close I had come to never seeing my family again. When we reached the next town, I checked into a motel and called the police to report what had happened. They took my statement, but warned me that with so little to go on, it was unlikely they'd be able to track the guy down. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound. When morning came, I seriously considered quitting trucking altogether. But I have a family to support, and this job is all I know. In the end, I went back to work, but things haven't been the same since. I'm constantly on edge, especially when driving at night. I never stop on isolated stretches of road anymore, no matter what, and I always keep my doors locked. I know how lucky I am to have survived that night, but the fear never really goes away. Sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of headlights in my mirror and my heart will start racing. For a split second, I'm back on that dark desert highway, fighting for my life. I don't know if they ever caught the guy who attacked me. Part of me hopes they did, so he can't hurt anyone else. But another part of me is terrified that he's still out there somewhere, waiting for his next victim. All I know is that I'll never forget that night, or how close I came to becoming another statistic, another mysterious disappearance on a lonely stretch of highway. If you're reading this and you drive long hauls, please be careful out there. You never know what kind of monsters might be lurking in the darkness. Been driving trucks for over 15 years, crisscrossing the country more times than I can count. I thought I'd seen it all. Crazy drivers, weird hitchhikers, you name it. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was a typical long-haul run, taking a load from California to Texas. I'd been on the road for hours, and fatigue was starting to set in. The desert stretched out endlessly on either side of the highway, nothing but darkness and cacti as far as the eye could see. I was looking forward to finding a place to pull over and catch some shut-eye. Around 2 a.m., I spotted a sign for an upcoming rest stop. Perfect timing. As I pulled off the highway, I immediately got an uneasy feeling. The place was pitch black, no lights anywhere. Weird for a rest stop, even at that hour. But I was too exhausted to care much. I figured I'd just park, catch a few hours of sleep, and be on my way. I maneuvered my rig into one of the abandoned parking spots. The crumbling pavement was overgrown with weeds, and the whole place had a creepy, derelict vibe. But hey, it was just for a few hours. I killed the engine and settled in for some much-needed rest. I must have dozed off for a bit because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud bang on the side of my truck. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I sat bolt upright, trying to get my bearings. Another bang, this time on the passenger side door. What the hell? I peered out the window, but couldn't see a damn thing in the inky blackness. Bang, 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 now on the back of the trailer. Jesus Christ, was someone trying to break in? My mind raced through the possibilities. Was it cops? Hijackers? I fumbled for the key, ready to start the engine and get the hell out of there. But before I could, I caught a glimpse of movement outside my driver's side window. I froze. There, in the faint moonlight, was a figure. Tall, unnaturally thin, dressed in some kind of dark robe or cloak with a hood obscuring its face. It was just standing there, perfectly still, staring right at me. I'm not ashamed to admit I nearly pissed myself right then and there. This was some horror movie shit. I tried to convince myself I was dreaming, but the hammering of my heart told me otherwise. Slowly, painfully slowly, the figure raised one arm and pointed directly at me. I felt the blood drain from my face, and then, to my utter horror, 2 more identical figures emerged from the darkness to stand beside the first. 3 of them now, all motionless, all pointing at me. I couldn't make out any features under those hoods, just inky blackness where faces should be. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. It felt like hours. The pounding on my truck had stopped, but somehow the silence was even worse. Those things never moved, never made a sound, just kept pointing. Finally, I managed to shake off enough of my terror to reach for the key again. As soon as I did, all 3 figures took a synchronized step towards my truck. I swear to God, I almost had a heart attack right then. But just as I was certain I was about to die, headlights suddenly illuminated the scene. Another truck was pulling into the rest stop. I've never been so relieved in my life. As the headlights swept across the parking lot, the 3 figures seemed to melt away into the shadows. 1 second they were there, the next, gone. The other truck pulled up a few spots away from me. I wanted to jump out and run to the driver, beg them not to leave me alone, but I was still too terrified to move. After a few minutes, when nothing else happened, I finally worked up the courage to start my engine. I got the hell out of there as fast as I could, not even bothering to check if the other truck was still there. I drove straight through till morning, terrified that if I stopped, those things would somehow find me again. When the sun finally came up, I pulled over at a busy truck stop and broke down sobbing in my cab. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was some sick prank, or I hallucinated from exhaustion. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. Those weren't people in costumes. There was something deeply wrong, something inhuman about them. I've never gone back to that stretch of highway, and I never will. I've heard rumors from other drivers about strange experiences at abandoned rest stops in the desert. Makes me wonder if I'm not the only one who's had a run-in with those hooded figures. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I'm on the road at night. I keep expecting to look in my rearview mirror and see those pointed fingers again. I don't know what would have happened if that other truck hadn't shown up when it did. And honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is, I'll never forget that night as long as I live. And I'll sure as hell never stop at an abandoned rest stop again. I've been a long-haul trucker for going on 15 years now. I've driven just about every major interstate and back road you can think of, at all hours of the day and night. I thought I'd seen it all out there on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for that night in West Texas. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. I was hauling a load of electronics from Dallas to El Paso, taking Highway 180 west through some of the most desolate country you can imagine. Miles and miles of nothing but scrubby desert and oil derricks as far as the eye can see. I'd been driving since early that morning and was starting to feel the fatigue setting in. The sun had set about an hour earlier, leaving nothing but inky blackness outside my windshield, broken only by the glow of my headlights on the empty road ahead. I remember thinking to myself that I should probably find somewhere to pull over soon and catch some shut-eye. That's when I first noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. It had been a while since I'd seen another vehicle out here, but it wasn't that unusual. Probably just another trucker, or maybe some locals heading home after a late night. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to get an uneasy feeling. The car behind me was maintaining a constant distance, not gaining on me, but not falling back either. Just sitting there, maybe a quarter mile behind me, close enough that I could clearly see the headlights, but not close enough to make out any details of the vehicle. I tried to shake off the paranoia. "You're just tired," I told myself. "Your mind is playing tricks on you." I focused on the road ahead and cranked up the radio, trying to distract myself. But after about 20 minutes of this, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something wasn't right. I'd driven plenty of night shifts before, but I'd never experienced anything quite like this. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I decided to test my theory. I gradually increased my speed from 65 up to 75 mph. The headlights behind me kept pace perfectly, maintaining that same eerie distance. I slowed back down to 60. Again, the gap remained unchanged. My heart was really starting to race now. What the hell was going on? Who was this person, and why were they following me like this? I thought about pulling over, but quickly dismissed that idea. If this was some kind of crazy person, the last thing I wanted to do was stop in the middle of nowhere and give them a chance to catch up to me. So I kept driving, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, as I stared intently at those unwavering headlights in my mirror. That's when things got really weird. I came around a bend in the road, and suddenly the headlights were gone. Just like that, vanished into thin air. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But not 30 seconds later, they reappeared, in the exact same position as before. I felt my blood run cold. This wasn't possible. There were no turn-offs or side roads they could have taken. The desert stretched for miles on either side of the highway. There was nowhere for a car to go. Over the next 2 hours, This bizarre cat-and-mouse game continued. The phantom car would disappear around a curve or over a hill, only to materialize again moments later. Sometimes it would vanish for 5 or 10 minutes at a time, lulling me into a false sense of security before suddenly popping up again. At one point, I got so freaked out that I pulled into a rest stop, thinking maybe I could wait them out. But as soon as I came to a stop, the headlights behind me accelerated rapidly. They were coming right for me, closing the distance fast. In a panic, I threw the truck into gear and peeled out of there, my heart pounding in my chest. As soon as I was back on the highway, the car returned to its usual position, keeping that same maddening distance behind me. It was toying with me now, and I knew it. I've never felt fear like I did in those hours. Pure, primal terror. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some logical explanation for what was happening. But there was nothing logical about this situation. Finally, mercifully, I saw lights up ahead. A small truck stop materialized out of the darkness, an oasis of fluorescent lighting and humanity in the vast emptiness of the West Texas night. I pulled in and screeched to a stop next to one of the gas pumps, not even bothering to line up properly. I practically fell out of the cab, my legs shaky beneath me. The lot was empty, except for one other semi and a beat-up pickup truck. I stumbled into the store, probably looking like a madman. The clerk behind the counter, an older guy with a scraggly gray beard, gave me a concerned look. "You all right there, buddy? You're white as a sheet." I tried to collect myself, taking a few deep breaths before responding. "Yeah, I think so. Listen, this is gonna sound crazy, but have you ever heard any stories about strange things happening out on the highway? Like maybe ghostly vehicles or something?" The clerk's expression changed instantly. He narrowed his eyes at me. "Why do you ask?" I hesitated, not sure how much to say, but I was desperate for answers, so I spilled the whole story. The phantom car, the impossible disappearances and reappearances, all of it. When I finished, the old man let out a long, slow whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. You ain't the first to come in here with a tale like that, son. Not by a long shot." My eyes widened. "What? You mean this has happened to other people?" He nodded gravely. "Oh yeah. Couple times a year, I get truckers in here talking about being followed by some kind of ghost car out there in the desert. Always the same stretch of road, always at night. Nobody knows what it is or why it happens, but it's been going on for decades from what I hear." I felt a chill run down my spine. What happens to the people who see it?" The clerk shrugged. "Far as I know, nothing. They all make it here eventually, scared out of their wits just like you. But I've never heard of the thing actually hurting anybody. It's like it's just playing some kind of twisted game." I glanced nervously out the window at the empty parking lot. So what should I do? I still have another 4 hours of driving ahead of me. "Well, you're welcome to hang out here as long as you need to settle your nerves. But honestly, I'd say just get back on the road. Whatever that thing is out there, it seems to lose interest once folks get closer to civilization. You'll probably be fine from here on out." I nodded slowly, trying to process everything. Part of me wanted to call it quits, turn around and head back east. But I had a delivery to make, and I couldn't afford to lose this job. So after downing a cup of coffee and taking about 20 minutes to collect myself, I hesitantly climbed back into my rig. The clerk's words had calmed me somewhat, but I still felt a knot of dread in my stomach as I pulled out of the lot and back onto the empty highway. To my immense relief, the phantom car didn't reappear. The rest of my drive was uneventful, and I made it to El Paso without further incident. But I've never been able to shake the memory of that night. The inexplicable terror of those hours alone in the dark, pursued by something I couldn't explain or understand. I don't know what to make of it all. Was it some kind of mass hallucination? A local urban legend that has taken on a life of its own? Or is there really something supernatural out there in the Texas desert, endlessly replaying its enigmatic performance for unlucky travelers? I don't have any answers. All I know is that I'll never drive that stretch of Highway 180 at night again. And if you find yourself out that way after dark, keep a close eye on your rearview mirror. You never know what might be lurking just beyond the reach of your tail lights. It was a foggy October evening when I set out from Knoxville with a load bound for Pittsburgh. The weather report warned of dense fog in the mountains, but I had a tight deadline to meet. As I wound my way up into the hills, visibility got worse and worse. Soon I could barely see 20 feet in front of my rig. The fog seemed to swallow up my headlights. It was like driving through cotton balls. I white-knuckled the wheel, peering intently ahead and praying no deer would dart out. The GPS was useless. The winding mountain roads confused it. So I relied on my knowledge of the route and watched for mile markers in the haze. About 2 hours in, my radio started acting up. At first I thought it was just interference from the mountains, but then I realized I was picking up a station that shouldn't have been coming in that clear up there. The music faded in and out, replaced by bursts of static. And then I heard it, a woman's voice, faint but distinct, whispering, "Don't look back." I tried changing the station, but the voice kept coming through. "Don't look back," it repeated, more urgently this time. A chill ran down my spine. I jabbed at the power button, but the radio wouldn't turn off. That's when I noticed something in my side mirror. At first I thought it was just mist swirling in my wake, but no, there was a definite shape there. As I stared, it coalesced into a human figure, pale and indistinct. My heart nearly stopped. I blinked hard and looked again. Nothing there, just fog. I let out a shaky laugh, telling myself I was seeing things. The lack of sleep must be getting to me. I resolved to pull over at the next rest stop and splash some water on my face. But a few minutes later, I saw it again. This time in my rearview mirror, a ghostly woman in a flowing dress, her face a blur. She raised a hand, pointing at me. I yelped and swerved, nearly running off the road. When I looked back, she was gone. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep hold of the wheel. This couldn't be real. I must be hallucinating from exhaustion. But then why did it feel so vivid? The radio crackled again. "Don't look back. He's coming." Who was coming? What the hell was happening? I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But there was no signal up here in the mountains. I was completely alone. I pressed down on the accelerator, eager to get out of these God-forsaken hills. But the fog only seemed to thicken. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision. More than once I could have sworn I saw faces peering out of the mist, vanishing when I looked directly at them. The whispering on the radio grew more frantic. Multiple voices now overlapping. "Don't stop. Keep going. He's almost here. Don't look back." I wanted to scream, to pull over and run away into the night. But some primal instinct kept me driving, as if my life depended on it. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the truck's tires screeching. For a split second I saw him clearly, a tall man in a black suit, his face a featureless void. Then he vanished, like smoke dispersing. I sat there hyperventilating, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. This couldn't be happening. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it all to go away. When I opened them, the road ahead was clear, but a glance in my mirror showed the man standing right behind my trailer, staring at me with that blank face. I floored it. The truck roared up the mountain road, taking curves way too fast. I didn't care if I crashed at this point, I just had to get away. The voices on the radio reached a fever pitch, screaming now, "He's here! Don't look back!" Against my better judgment, I looked in the mirror again. The man in black was somehow keeping pace with my speeding truck, gliding along the road. As I watched in horror, he began to rise into the air, floating towards my cab. I let out a shriek and swerved hard, nearly jackknifing the trailer. When I straightened out, the apparition was gone. The radio fell silent. I drove on in a daze, hardly daring to breathe. I don't know how long I kept going like that. Hours, maybe. I was beyond exhausted, running on pure adrenaline and terror. Finally, miraculously, I broke out of the fog. The pre-dawn sky was just beginning to lighten as I coasted down into a little valley town. I pulled into the first gas station I saw and stumbled out of the cab on shaky legs. The tired-looking attendant gave me a strange look as I burst through the door, wild-eyed and babbling. I must have seemed like a lunatic, ranting about ghosts and voices on the radio. He just nodded and handed me a cup of coffee. As the caffeine hit my system, I started to calm down a bit. In the harsh fluorescent light of the convenience store, it all seemed absurd. Had I really seen those things, or had I just dozed off at the wheel and had some kind of waking nightmare? I called my dispatcher and told him I was taking a personal day. Then I got a motel room and slept for 14 hours straight. When I woke up, I almost managed to convince myself it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. Almost. But I can't shake the feeling that something truly supernatural happened to me that night. I've tried to rationalize it, to explain it away, but deep down, I know what I experienced was real. I completed that run to Pittsburgh, but I haven't been back to the Appalachians since. I make excuses, take other routes. My co-workers think I'm crazy for adding hours to my trips just to avoid those mountains. But they weren't there. They didn't see what I saw. Sometimes late at night, when I'm alone in my cab, I swear I can still hear that whisper coming through the static. Don't look back, and I never, ever do. I was working as a waitress at this small diner on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a fancy place, but the regulars were nice, and the tips were decent enough. That night, I was stuck with the closing shift. It was the middle of winter, bitterly cold outside, and business had been slow all evening. By 10 p.m., the place was practically empty. I was wiping down tables, counting down the minutes until I could lock up and head home, when the bell above the door chimed. 4 guys walked in, laughing and talking loudly. My heart sank. Late-night customers were always a pain, especially when you're trying to close up. As they settled into a booth, I plastered on my best fake smile and went over to take their order. That's when I first noticed him, the one in the leather jacket. He had this intense stare that made my skin crawl. While his buddies ordered burgers and fries, he just kept eyeing me up and down. "What can I get for you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He smirked and said, "How about your number, sweetheart?" I forced a laugh and deflected, telling him I'd give him a few more minutes to look at the menu. As I walked away, I could feel his eyes on me. A shiver ran down my spine. For the next hour, I did my best to avoid their table as much as possible. But every time I had to go over there, leather jacket guy would make some crude comment or try to grab my arm. His friends seemed to think it was hilarious. I was counting down the seconds until they'd leave. Finally, around 11:30, they paid their bill and headed out. I breathed a huge sigh of relief as I watched them pile into a beat-up truck in the parking lot. With shaking hands, I locked the front door and finished closing up as quickly as I could. By the time I grabbed my coat and purse from the back, it was just after midnight. The restaurant was dark and silent. I always hated leaving through the rear exit. It opened up into a dimly lit alley behind the building. But it was closest to where I parked my car. I pushed open the heavy metal door, shivering as the frigid air hit me. That's when I saw him. Leather jacket guy was leaning against the brick wall, smoking a cigarette. My blood ran cold. How long had he been waiting out here? He grinned when he saw me, flicking his cigarette to the ground. "There you are, darlin'. Thought you'd never come out." I clutched my keys tightly, trying to keep my voice steady. "The restaurant's closed. You need to leave." He took a step closer. "Ah, come on, don't be like that. I just want to talk." "I'm not interested," I said firmly, walking briskly towards my car. "Please leave me alone." But he followed, matching my pace. "Hey, where you rushing off to? The night's still young." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I fumbled with my keys, desperately trying to get my car door open. But my hands were shaking so badly, I dropped them. As I bent to grab them, he made his move. His hand clamped down on my arm, yanking me upright. "Don't be a bitch," he snarled, his breath hot on my face. "I've been real patient with you all night." Terror flooded through me. This couldn't be happening. I tried to wrench my arm free, but his grip was like iron. "Let go of me," I shouted, praying someone would hear. But the parking lot was deserted. He started dragging me towards his truck. "We're gonna go for a little ride, you and me." In that moment, something inside me snapped. All the fear and anger I'd been holding back exploded out. I remembered a self-defense class I'd taken years ago, the instructor's voice echoing in my head. "Use whatever you have as a weapon." I gripped my keys tightly, the points sticking out between my fingers. Then I swung my fist as hard as I could, aiming for his face. The keys raked across his cheek, drawing blood. He howled in pain and shock, his grip loosening just enough for me to wrench free. I bolted for my car, adrenaline coursing through me. This time my shaking hands cooperated. I got the key in the lock, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. I could hear him shouting and swearing behind me as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as he reached my car. He pounded on the window, his face contorted with rage. "You fucking bitch! I'll kill you!" I slammed on the gas, tires squealing as I peeled out of the parking lot. In my rearview mirror, I could see him standing there, blood trickling down his face, screaming after me. I drove for what felt like hours, terrified he might be following me. When I finally got home, I double-checked all the locks and spent the rest of the night huddled on my couch, jumping at every little sound. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't bear the thought of going back there. When I finally did return a few days later, I switched to the day shift. I never saw Leather Jacket Guy or his friends again, but for weeks afterwards, every customer that walked in made me flinch. It's been months now, but I still have nightmares about that night. I've started taking self-defense classes again, determined to never feel that helpless again. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't fought back. The thought makes me sick to my stomach. I know I'm lucky. So many women don't escape situations like that. But I hate that I even have to consider myself lucky for not being assaulted or worse. No one should have to go through something like that just for doing their job. I'm sharing this story because I want other women to know it's okay to fight back. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And never be afraid to make a scene or hurt someone who's trying to hurt you. Your safety matters more than being polite or avoiding embarrassment. That night changed me. I'm more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings. But I'm also stronger. I know now that I can protect myself if I have to, and that knowledge is powerful. To anyone reading this who's been through something similar, you're not alone. It wasn't your fault, and you're stronger than you know. We shouldn't have to live in fear, but until the world changes, we have to look out for each other and ourselves. Stay safe out there. I took the job out of desperation. The pay was incredible, way more than I could make on land. But from the moment I set foot on that massive steel structure in the middle of the ocean, something felt off. The other workers seemed on edge, exchanging nervous glances when they thought no one was looking. My first few weeks passed in a blur of 12-hour shifts and fitful sleep. The work was grueling, but I kept reminding myself of the fat paycheck waiting at the end. Then came the announcement. There would be a special event that evening. Attendance was mandatory. We all gathered in the mess hall after dinner. The rig manager, a burly man named Hank, stood at the front holding an old leather bag. "Time for the quarterly drawing," he said gruffly. My stomach dropped. Drawing? What drawing? Hank reached into the bag and pulled out a folded slip of paper. The room went deadly silent as he read the name, Clive Harper. A strangled cry came from the back of the room. I turned to see a wiry man with graying hair, his face drained of all color. Two other workers grabbed Clive's arms as he tried to bolt for the door. "I'm sorry, Clive," Hank said, not sounding sorry at all. "But you know the rules. It has to be done." Clive's screams echoed through the metal hallways as they dragged him away. I felt frozen in place, unable to process what was happening. The other workers filed out silently, avoiding eye contact. I cornered my bunkmate later that night, demanding answers. He just shook his head. "Don't ask questions if you want to keep your job and your life," he warned. "Just be grateful it wasn't you." Sleep eluded me that night. I tossed and turned, Clive's cries replaying in my head. What had they done to him? The next morning, we were herded to the main deck. Clive stood at the center, eyes wild with terror. His clothes had been stripped away, leaving him in just his boxers. Strange symbols were painted on his skin in what looked horribly like blood. Hank approached, carrying a large jug filled with thick black liquid, crude oil. My stomach churned as I realized what was about to happen. "Open," Hank commanded. When Clive clamped his mouth shut, two men pried his jaws apart. Hank began to pour the oil down Clive's throat. Clive gagged and choked, black liquid dribbling down his chin, but they didn't stop. They kept pouring until the jug was empty, and Clive collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. What happened next was even worse. On some unspoken signal, the other workers surged forward. They began smearing more of that foul oil on Clive's body, tracing bizarre patterns and symbols. Clive's screams turned to whimpers as dozens of hands pawed at him. I wanted to look away, to run, to do something. But I was rooted to the spot, bile rising in my throat. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sick hazing ritual or prank. But the grim faces around me said otherwise. After what felt like hours, Hank raised his hand and the frenzy stopped. Clive lay curled in a fetal position, covered head to toe in black oil and red symbols. He twitched occasionally but made no sound. "It is done," Hank intoned. "The offering has been made. May the depths be satisfied and our work continue unhindered." A low rumble seemed to emanate from somewhere far below us. The entire rig shuddered briefly. Several workers made signs to ward off evil. "Back to work," Hank barked. "Double overtime for everyone this week." Just like that, it was over. People shuffled back to their posts as if nothing had happened. I felt like I was going to be sick. Clive was nowhere to be seen for the next few days. When I asked about him, I got only stony silence or muttered warnings to mind my own business. A week later, Clive reappeared, but he wasn't the same. His eyes had a glassy, vacant look. He moved stiffly, like a puppet on strings. When I tried to talk to him, he just stared through me. I lasted another month on that godforsaken rig before I couldn't take it anymore. I quit without notice, catching the next chopper to shore. The HR rep tried to get me to sign some intense non-disclosure agreements, but I refused. What were they going to do? Kill me? It's been years now, but I still have nightmares about that day on the deck. The black oil, the blood-red symbols, Clive's screams. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can hear that low rumble from the depths. I've tried researching the Kraken rig since then. It's still operating, still pulling in record profits year after year. But there are whispers, rumors of disappearances, of rituals, of something ancient and hungry lurking in the oil fields below. I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that I'll never set foot on an oil rig again. And every 3 months, I say a silent prayer for whoever's name might be pulled from that leather bag. I had been planning this trip for months, my first solo adventure abroad. Costa Rica seemed like the perfect destination. Beautiful beaches, lush rainforests, and a reputation for being relatively safe for tourists. I was so excited as I landed in San Jose, ready to explore this tropical paradise. The first few days were amazing. I hiked through Manuel Antonio National Park, saw sloths and monkeys up close, and relaxed on pristine beaches. I was feeling confident and empowered as a solo traveler. That all changed on my 4th night there. I had just arrived in the small coastal town of Samara and decided to treat myself to dinner at a local restaurant. As I sat down at the bar, an older man a few seats away struck up a conversation. He looked to be in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a friendly smile. He introduced himself as John and said he was an American expat who had been living in Costa Rica for years. At first, our chat was pleasant enough. He gave me some tips on hidden beaches and the best places to see wildlife. But as the night went on, I started to feel a bit uncomfortable. John kept inching his seat closer to mine and his questions became more personal. He wanted to know where I was staying, how long I'd be in town, if I was traveling alone. I tried to keep things vague, but he was persistent. When I finished my meal, I politely excused myself and headed back to my Airbnb. As I walked down the dimly lit street, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind me. I quickened my pace and ducked into a small convenience store, pretending to browse while I gathered myself. After a few minutes, I peeked out the door. The street was empty. Shaken, but relieved, I made it back to my rental and double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked. I tried to shake off my paranoia, telling myself I was just being overly cautious, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to go for a run on the beach to clear my head. As I jogged along the shore, I saw a figure in the distance walking towards me. My blood ran cold, as I realized it was John. He waved and called out cheerfully, "Good morning. What a coincidence running into you here." But it wasn't a coincidence. He had clearly been waiting for me. I mumbled a quick hello and sprinted past him, my heart pounding. When I looked back over my shoulder, he was just standing there watching me run away. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every sound and constantly looking over my shoulder. That evening, I decided to stay in and order takeout to my Airbnb. As I sat on the small patio eating my dinner, movement in the shadows across the street caught my eye. A chill ran down my spine as I made out John's silhouette, partially hidden behind a tree. He was just standing there, staring at me. I rushed inside and locked the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I called the local police, but by the time they arrived 20 minutes later, John was gone. The officers took my statement, but didn't seem overly concerned. They assured me they would keep an eye out, but I could tell they thought I was just an hysterical tourist. Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak and rustle outside sent my heart racing. Around 2 a.m. I heard it, a soft tapping on my bedroom window. I froze, too terrified to move. The tapping came again, more insistent this time. Summoning all my courage, I peeked through a crack in the curtains. John's face was pressed against the glass, his eyes wild and intense. When he saw me, a slow, eerie smile spread across his face. I screamed and scrambled for my phone, frantically dialing the police again. By the time they arrived, John had vanished once more. This time the officers seemed to take me more seriously. They searched the area and took photos of some footprints outside my window. They advised me to check out of my Airbnb immediately and move to a more secure hotel in town. One of the officers even escorted me there himself. I spent the next 2 days barricaded in my hotel room, too scared to leave. I changed my flight and booked the first ticket home I could find. As I waited for my departure date, I obsessively checked the locks and jumped at every sound. I kept expecting to see John's face appear in the window at any moment. The relief I felt when I finally boarded my plane home was indescribable. But even as we took off, a nagging fear remained. What if John had somehow followed me? What if he knew where I lived back home? It's been months since my trip, but I still have nightmares about those glassy eyes staring at me through the window. I've become paranoid, always looking over my shoulder and checking the locks multiple times before bed. I used to love traveling, but now the thought of going anywhere alone fills me with dread. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. The scariest part is not knowing why John targeted me or what his intentions were. Was he just a lonely man who took things too far, or something much more sinister? I'll never know, and that uncertainty haunts me every day. To any solo female travelers out there, please be careful. Trust your instincts. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. I used to think things like this only happened in movies, but my experience in Costa Rica taught me that real-life horrors can be far more terrifying than anything on screen. I'm sharing my story in hopes that it might help someone else avoid a similar situation. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and remember that even in paradise, danger can be lurking just around the corner. From day one, there was something off about Marco. He had these intense, piercing eyes that seemed to look right through you. And despite his fame, he was oddly reclusive, rarely interacting with the staff or diners. But I brushed it off, figuring eccentricity came with genius. Things were going well at first. I was learning so much and really honing my skills. But then I started noticing some weird things, like how Marco would disappear into the walk-in freezer for long stretches, way longer than needed to grab ingredients, and the strange, pungent smell that would sometimes waft from there. Not food, but something chemical, herbal. I couldn't place it. There were other odd occurrences, too. How the restaurant was always packed, even on typically slow nights. The slightly dazed look some diners had, like they were in a trance. The way certain menu items would sell out instantly, as if people were compelled to order them. My curiosity got the better of me. One night after closing, I snuck back to the kitchen to do some snooping. I crept towards the walk-in, heart pounding. As I reached for the handle, I heard footsteps and ducked behind a shelf. It was Marco, looking furtive as he entered the freezer. I waited a few minutes, then followed. The heavy door creaked as I eased it open. At first glance, everything looked normal, shelves of produce, meat, etc. But as I ventured further back, I saw a curtain partially obscuring a corner. Drawing it aside, I gasped. There was a small altar set up, draped in dark cloth. Candles, crystals, and strange symbols were arranged on it. But most disturbing were the jars of something. Powders, liquids, what looked like blood. My stomach churned as I realized this must be where Marco was disappearing to. I was so transfixed I didn't hear the door open. Suddenly Marco's voice boomed out. "What are you doing in here?" I whirled around, stammering excuses. But his face was calm, almost amused. "Curious little chef, aren't you?" he said, approaching slowly. "Well, now that you've seen, I suppose I should explain." Over the next hour, Marco revealed the truth, and it was more horrifying than I could have imagined. He'd been practicing dark magic for years, using it to ensnare customers and ensure the restaurant's success. The strange ingredients were components in his spells and potions. "You see," he explained, "running a restaurant is cutthroat. I needed an edge, so I made some arrangements, a few sacrifices here and there, nothing major. And in return, I can fill seats every night, make people crave my food like an addiction." I felt sick. That's evil. You're manipulating people." Marco laughed coldly. "Evil? No, it's business. Besides, everyone wins. They get an amazing meal. I get success. Where's the harm?" I can't be a part of this," I stammered. "I'm leaving. I'll find another job." His eyes flashed dangerously. "Oh, I'm afraid that's not an option, my dear. You know far too much now. But don't worry. You won't be the first little chef to, shall we say, contribute to the cause." Terror gripped me as his meaning sunk in. Without thinking, I shoved past him and ran. Out of the freezer, through the kitchen, not stopping until I was blocks away. I quit via email that night and never went back. It's been weeks now, and I still have nightmares about that altar, about Marco's cold eyes. I've thought about going to the police, but who would believe me? Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, but then I'll catch a whiff of that strange smell, or see an ad for La Bella Luna, still packed every night, and I know it was real. I don't know what to do with this knowledge. All I know is that I'll never look at a busy restaurant the same way again. Who knows what dark secrets might be hiding in the kitchen? The whole experience has left me shaken and paranoid. I keep expecting Marco or his associates to come after me. Every time I see someone in chef whites on the street, my heart races. I've been having trouble sleeping, plagued by vivid nightmares of being trapped in that freezer, surrounded by grotesque ingredients and malevolent energy. I've tried to move on, even started looking for new kitchen jobs, but my passion for cooking has been tainted. Every time I pick up a knife or smell spices, I'm transported back to that night. I wonder if the food I'm preparing has been tampered with, if I'm unknowingly participating in some dark ritual. The worst part is the guilt. How many people did I unknowingly help Marco ensnare while I worked there? Were the dishes I lovingly prepared being used as vehicles for his spells? The thought makes me sick. I've become obsessed with researching occult practices, trying to understand what Marco might have been doing. Some of the things I've learned have only deepened my horror. The potential for manipulation and harm is staggering. There are moments when I consider going back, trying to gather evidence or confront Marco. But then I remember the cold calculation in his eyes, the casual way he spoke of sacrifice, and I know it would be suicide. I've thought about reaching out to former co-workers, but I'm afraid of putting them in danger, or worse, finding out they're in on it too. The isolation is crushing. I feel like I'm carrying this huge, dark secret, and there's no one I can talk to. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if maybe I should have stayed, if I could have learned to harness that power too. The thought terrifies me, but it's there, insidious and tempting. Is this how Marco started down his dark path? I've started noticing other restaurants in town with suspiciously consistent crowds, wondering if there are more like Marco out there. Are there entire networks of occult chefs trading spells like recipes? The possibilities are endless and horrifying. I know I should probably leave town, start fresh somewhere new, but something keeps me here. Maybe it's a misguided sense of responsibility, feeling like I need to watch and warn others somehow. Or maybe it's Marco's magic still having some hold on me, even from a distance. All I know is that my life has been irrevocably changed. I can't unsee what I saw in that freezer, can't unknow the truth about what goes on behind the scenes at La Bella Luna. I'm left with nothing but questions and a gnawing fear that this is only the tip of the iceberg. So I guess I'll keep moving forward, one day at a time, trying to rebuild my life and my love of cooking, but always looking over my shoulder, always wondering what other dark secrets might be lurking just out of sight in the kitchens of the world. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that you can never really know what's going on behind closed doors. So the next time you're enjoying a meal at a popular restaurant, take a moment to really look around. Are the other diners a little too entranced? Does the food taste a little too addictively good? And most importantly, what's really going on back in that kitchen? Because trust me, some things are better left undiscovered. I just hope my story serves as a warning to others. Stay curious, but be careful. You never know what kind of darkness you might uncover. One of our regulars was this guy, Adrian. He seemed normal enough at first, mid-30s, always ordered the same thing, coffee and apple pie, polite but kept to himself. He'd come in a few times a week, usually late at night when it was slow. I didn't think much of him until I started noticing how he'd watch me. It was subtle at first. I'd be refilling someone's coffee and catch his eyes following me across the room. Or I'd look up from the counter to see him quickly glance away. I tried to brush it off as nothing, but it kept happening more and more. Then he started trying to chat with me every time I went to his table. At first it was just small talk about the weather or asking how my shift was going, but it got more personal, asking about my family, where I went to school, what I did in my free time. I tried to keep my answers vague and professional, but he was persistent. One night, he left a napkin with his phone number on it, asking me to call him sometime. I threw it away and told my manager, who said he'd keep an eye on the situation. But Adrian kept coming in, kept watching me, kept trying to talk to me. Things escalated when I started noticing him outside the diner. I'd be walking to my car after a late shift and catch a glimpse of him sitting in his truck in the parking lot. Or I'd be running errands on my day off and spot him following a few cars behind me. It was like he was everywhere. The breaking point came about 2 months after he first started coming to the diner. I was wiping down tables at the end of my shift when Adrian came in. He sat at the counter and ordered his usual, then pulled out his phone. I heard the camera shutter sound and looked up to see him quickly lowering the phone. He'd taken a picture of me without my permission. I confronted him, telling him that wasn't okay and asking him to delete it. He just smiled this creepy smile and said, "Don't worry, I've got plenty of others." Then he held up his phone and started swiping through photo after photo of me, at work, walking to my car, at the grocery store, even one of me getting the mail at my apartment. I felt sick to my stomach. I ran to the back and told my manager what happened. He called the police, but by the time they arrived, Adrian was gone. I filed a report, but they said there wasn't much they could do since he hadn't technically broken any laws. They suggested I get a restraining order. The next few weeks were a nightmare. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. I'd wake up in the middle of the night convinced I heard someone outside my window. My roommate started walking me to and from my car. I changed my routine, varied the times I left for work, took different routes home. But Adrian always seemed to find me. He'd show up at the diner during my shifts, sitting for hours nursing a cup of coffee and watching me. I'd see his truck parked on my street when I got home. One day, I found an envelope of pictures of me slipped under my apartment door, all taken without my knowledge over the past few months. I finally got the restraining order approved, but it didn't seem to deter him. He'd still show up places, always staying just far enough away to not technically violate the order. The police said there was nothing they could do unless he actually approached me. I couldn't take it anymore. I quit my job at the diner and found a new one across town. I moved to a new apartment with better security. I deleted all my social media accounts. I even dyed my hair and started dressing differently, hoping he wouldn't recognize me. For a while, it seemed to work. I didn't see Adrian for almost a month. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe he'd finally given up. But then last week, I was walking to my car after my shift at the new job. As I got closer, I noticed something stuck under the windshield wiper. My heart started racing as I approached. It was a photograph of me, taken earlier that day as I was leaving my new apartment, and written on the back in messy handwriting, "I'll always find you." I'm terrified. I don't know what to do anymore. The police still say there's nothing they can do unless he actually hurts me. But I know it's only a matter of time before he escalates things further. I'm constantly on edge, always looking over my shoulder. I can't sleep, can't eat. I feel like a prisoner in my own life. I don't know how this is going to end, but I'm scared it won't be good. Adrian is out there somewhere, watching, waiting, and I have no idea how to stop him or when he'll strike next. All I can do is stay vigilant and hope that somehow, some way, this nightmare will end before it's too late. I'm sorry if this is rambling or doesn't make sense. I'm still shaken up and haven't really told anyone the full story before. I just needed to get it out, to feel like someone else knows what's happening. If anyone has been through something similar or has any advice, I'd be so grateful. I'm desperate for any help at this point. I just want my life back. I was born and raised in a small town nestled among dense forests, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and nothing much ever happens. Growing up, I spent countless hours exploring the woods, fishing in secluded streams, and generally enjoying the peace and quiet of nature. Little did I know that one ordinary day would shatter that tranquility forever. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I decided to go fishing at my favorite spot, a hidden lake deep in the forest that few people knew about. I'd discovered it years ago during one of my wanderings and had kept it as my personal sanctuary ever since. The lake was surrounded by towering pines and maples, their leaves just starting to turn golden and red. I packed up my old pickup truck with my fishing gear and a cooler of snacks and beer, looking forward to a relaxing evening by the water. The drive out there took about 45 minutes down winding dirt roads, getting progressively rougher the further I went. Eventually I reached the point where I had to continue on foot, hiking the last mile or so through increasingly thick underbrush. When I finally emerged at the shore of the lake, I breathed a sigh of contentment. The water was like glass, perfectly still and reflecting the trees and clouds above. Not another soul in sight, just as I liked it. I set up my folding chair and tackle box, cracked open a beer, and cast my line out into the cool, dark water. For a couple hours, I enjoyed the solitude, occasionally reeling in a decent-sized trout. The sun was starting to dip low on the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. I was considering packing up soon when movement on the far side of the lake caught my eye. At first I thought it was just a branch falling or maybe a deer coming down to drink. But as I squinted across the water, I realized it was a small boat slowly emerging from a hidden cove. I felt a prickle of unease. In all my years coming here, I'd never seen another person. The boat glided silently across the lake, and I could make out a solitary figure seated in it. As it drew closer, I saw it was a man, but something about him immediately set me on edge. He was rail-thin and pale, wearing tattered, dirty clothes that hung off his gaunt frame. But it was his face that truly chilled me to the bone. His skin was sallow and waxy, stretched tight across sharp cheekbones. Deep-set eyes stared unblinkingly in my direction, seeming to glow with an unnatural light. A wide, unsettling grin split his face, revealing yellowed teeth. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen in place as the strange man's boat drifted closer and closer to shore. When he was about 20 feet away, he suddenly spoke in a raspy voice that made my skin crawl. "I can't let you leave." That snapped me out of my paralysis. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding. What? Who are you?" I stammered. The man's grin widened impossibly further. "This is my lake. You've seen too much. I can't let you leave." As he said this, he slowly raised his hand, revealing a rusty revolver clutched in his bony fingers. Pure terror shot through me. I turned and ran, abandoning all my gear. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping my face as I sprinted deeper into the woods. Behind me, I heard the scrape of the boat on the shore and heavy footsteps pursuing me. "You can't escape," the man's voice called out, sounding far too close. "I won't let you leave." I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, gasping for breath as panic threatened to overwhelm me. The forest seemed to close in around me, shadows deepening as the last light faded. I had no idea where I was going, just desperately trying to put distance between me and my pursuer. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 15-20 minutes, I finally burst out of the tree line near where I'd parked my truck. I fumbled for my keys with shaking hands, glancing over my shoulder constantly. Just as I got the door open, I saw movement at the edge of the woods. The strange man emerged from the shadows, still grinning that terrible grin. He raised the gun, and I dove into the truck, slamming the door shut just as a shot rang out. The window exploded inward, showering me with glass. I jammed the key in the ignition and floored it, tires spinning in the dirt before finally gaining traction. As I sped away down the bumpy road, I saw the man standing in my rearview mirror, slowly lowering the gun. Even from that distance, I swear I could see his eyes gleaming as he watched me go. I drove home in a daze, hands shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheels straight. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had happened. Part of me wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I'd fallen asleep while fishing and had a vivid nightmare. But the shattered window and cuts on my arms from the flying glass were all too real. I went inside and poured myself a stiff drink, jumping at every little noise. I debated calling the police, but what would I even say? I had no proof, and it all sounded so unbelievable. As the night wore on, I started to calm down slightly. I told myself that I was safe now, that the strange man couldn't possibly know where I lived. I was just about to head to bed when I heard it, a soft scratching at my front door. My blood ran cold. I crept to the window and peeked out through the curtains. There, illuminated by the porch light, was the gaunt figure of the man from the lake. He was running his fingernails down the wood of the door, head cocked to the side as he listened. I stumbled back, barely suppressing a scream. This couldn't be happening. How had he found me? I grabbed my phone with trembling fingers and dialed 911, whispering frantically to the operator. As I waited for the police to arrive, the scratching continued, punctuated by that raspy voice calling out, "I know you're in there. I can't let you leave. You've seen too much." I cowered in my bedroom, a kitchen knife clutched in my sweaty palm. The scratching seemed to move around the house, as if he was trying to find a way in. Several times I heard tapping on my bedroom window, causing me to stifle sobs of terror. After what felt like an eternity, I heard sirens approaching. The scratching abruptly stopped. When the police arrived minutes later, they found no trace of the man. The only evidence was some faint scratch marks on my front door. They took my statement, but I could tell they were skeptical. They promised to keep an eye on the house and left. I didn't sleep at all that night, jumping at every creak and shadow. In the days that followed, I was a nervous wreck. I took time off work, afraid to leave my house. I installed security cameras and changed the locks. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes at night, I swear I catch glimpses of a pale face peering in through my windows. Other times I hear that raspy voice whispering on the wind, "I can't let you leave." It's been months now, and I still don't feel safe. I've thought about moving, but deep down I know it wouldn't matter. Wherever I go, he'll find me, because I've seen too much, and he can't let me leave. I don't know who or what that man was. Some deranged hermit living in the woods, a ghost, something worse. All I know is that my life will never be the same. That hidden lake was my sanctuary, my secret piece of paradise. Now it's become my eternal nightmare. So let this be a warning. Be careful exploring unknown places in the wilderness. You never know what secrets they might be hiding or what horrors you might unleash, because once you've seen too much, you can never truly escape. There were 4 of us, me, Mike, Dave, and John. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to get away from work and spend a weekend on the water. I'd managed to borrow my uncle's houseboat, which was way nicer than anything we could have afforded to rent. We loaded it up with food, beer, and fishing gear, feeling like kings as we set off onto the vast blue waters of the lake. The first day was perfect. We found a secluded cove to anchor in, cracked open some beers, and spent hours fishing and swimming in the crystal clear water. As the sun started to set, we fired up the grill and feasted on the bass we'd caught. Sitting on the deck under the stars, cold beers in hand, we all agreed this was the best trip ever. If only I'd known how quickly it would all go to hell. It was late afternoon the next day when we first spotted the other boat. We were out on the main part of the lake, cruising along and enjoying the scenery. Dave was the first to notice it, a small, beat-up-looking motorboat that seemed to be having engine trouble. There were 2 men on board, and they were waving their arms frantically, trying to get our attention. "Hey, should we go check on those guys?" Dave asked. "Looks like they might need help." I'll admit, I hesitated. Something about the whole scene felt off to me, but I couldn't put my finger on why. Still, I pushed the feeling aside. We couldn't just leave fellow boaters stranded out here. "Yeah, let's see what's up," I said, steering our houseboat in their direction. As we got closer, I could see the 2 men more clearly. They looked rough, scraggly beards, tattered clothes, weathered faces. Their boat was in even worse shape than I'd realized, barely staying afloat. "Hey there!" one of the men called out as we pulled alongside them. "Boy, are we glad to see you fellas. We've been stuck out here for hours." "Engine trouble?" I asked. The man nodded. "Ran out of gas, if you can believe it. Any chance you could spare some fuel to get us back to shore?" I glanced at my friends, who all nodded. "Sure, we can help you out," I said. "Just pull up to the back of the houseboat and we'll get you squared away." As the men maneuvered their boat around, Mike went to grab our spare gas can. We always kept an extra on board for emergencies. "Where are you guys from?" John asked as we waited. "Oh, just some locals," the other man said vaguely. "Don't get out on the water much. Guess that's pretty obvious, huh?" He let out a wheezy laugh that set my nerves on edge. We got them fueled up and sent them on their way with some extra sandwiches and water. As their boat puttered off into the distance, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Well, that was a good deed for the day," Dave said cheerfully. I nodded, trying to shake off my lingering unease. "Yeah, I'm glad we could help." We spent the rest of the afternoon fishing, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. I kept scanning the horizon, half expecting to see that ratty old boat reappear. When the sun started to set, I suggested we head back to our sheltered cove to anchor for the night. As darkness fell, we grilled up the rest of our fish and broke out the whiskey. The alcohol and good company helped me relax a bit. Soon we were laughing and swapping stories like always. Around midnight, we all turned in, pleasantly buzzed and ready for a good night's sleep. I'm not sure what woke me up. Some sixth sense, maybe. All I know is that one moment I was dead asleep, and the next I was wide awake, heart pounding. The cabin was pitch black and silent except for Dave's snoring from the bunk above me. Then I heard it, the faint creak of a floorboard out in the main cabin. I froze, straining my ears. It could just be one of the guys getting up to use the bathroom. But somehow, I knew it wasn't. Another creak, closer this time. I could hear someone's ragged breathing. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my phone on the nightstand. My fingers closed around it just as a beam of light swept across the room. A flashlight. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying whoever it was wouldn't notice I was awake. The light lingered for a moment, then moved on. My mind was racing. How many were there? What did they want? Where were my friends? I heard muffled voices and the sound of drawers being opened. They were looking for valuables. Keeping my movements as small as possible, I unlocked my phone and pulled up the keypad to call 911. But as soon as I hit the first number, I realized my mistake. The sound was deafening in the silent cabin. "Hey!" a gruff voice shouted. "We've got a live one in here." Heavy footsteps pounded towards our room. I leapt out of bed, frantically looking for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. The door burst open. 2 men stood there, the same men we'd helped earlier. But now their faces were twisted with malice, illuminated by the harsh glare of their flashlights. "Well, well," one of them sneered. "Looks like the party's just getting started." I opened my mouth to scream, to wake my friends, but before I could make a sound, something heavy collided with the side of my head. Pain exploded through my skull, and the world went dark. I'm not sure how long I was out. When I came to, I was on the floor of the main cabin, head throbbing. My friends were there too, all of us bound and gagged. The 2 men were ransacking the boat, shoving anything valuable into duffel bags. I locked eyes with Mike, saw the terror there that I knew was mirrored in my own face. How could this be happening? How had our perfect trip turned into this nightmare? For hours, we lay there helpless as the men tore the boat apart. They found our wallets, phones, watches, anything they thought might be worth something. But they didn't stop there. They ate our food, drank our beer, all while taunting us about how stupid we'd been to help them. As the sky outside began to lighten, the men finally seemed satisfied with their haul. They dragged us out onto the deck, still tied up. "Now, we're going to take your little boat here for a spin," one of them said, grinning wickedly. "Don't worry, we'll bring it back. Maybe." They untied the ropes anchoring us to the shore and fired up the engine. As we drifted out onto the open water, my stomach dropped. Were they planning to abandon us out here? But after about 20 minutes, they cut the engine. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but water and towering red cliffs. "End of the line, boys," the other man said. "Hope you can swim." Before I could process what was happening, they were hauling us to our feet. One by one, they shoved us overboard. I hit the water hard, the shock of the cold stealing my breath. For a terrifying moment, I thought I would drown, unable to swim with my hands still tied. But somehow, I managed to keep my head above water. I could see my friends splashing nearby, all of us struggling to stay afloat. The men laughed as they watched us flail. Then, to my utter disbelief, they started the engine again and sped off, leaving us bobbing in their wake. It took us nearly an hour to make it to shore, exhausted and half-drowned. We managed to free ourselves from our bonds and stumbled up onto a narrow strip of beach, collapsing on the sand. For a long time, no one spoke. We were all trying to wrap our heads around what had just happened. How quickly our carefree vacation had turned into a fight for survival. It was mid-afternoon by the time a passing boat spotted us and radioed for help. The police took our statements, but I could tell they were skeptical. 2 mysterious men who appeared out of nowhere, robbed us, and vanished without a trace? It sounded insane even to me, and I'd lived through it. They never found our boat or any sign of the men who'd terrorized us. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll catch a glimpse of the scar on my temple where they hit me, and it all comes rushing back. I haven't been back on the water since that day. My friends think I'm being ridiculous, that lightning doesn't strike twice. But they didn't see what I saw in those men's eyes. That cold, predatory gleam. The look of someone who enjoys causing pain. So I'll stick to dry land. Thank you very much. And if I ever see a stranded boater asking for help, well, I hate to say it, but they're on their own. I've been putting off writing about this for a long time, but I think I'm finally ready to share what happened that day at the lake with my grandpa. It's been almost a year now, but I still get chills thinking about it. Last summer, my 84-year-old grandpa invited me to go fishing with him at this remote lake about an hour's drive from his house. I was excited because we hadn't spent much one-on-one time together in years, and I knew how much he loved fishing when he was younger. What I didn't know was that he had been avoiding this particular lake for decades. We set out early in the morning, loading up his old pickup truck with fishing gear and a cooler full of sandwiches and drinks. The drive was beautiful, winding through dense forest on narrow dirt roads. Grandpa was quieter than usual, but I figured he was just tired from the early start. When we finally arrived at the lake, I was struck by how peaceful and pristine it looked. The water was like glass, perfectly reflecting the surrounding pines and the cloudy sky above. There wasn't another soul around, just us and nature. As we unloaded the truck, I noticed Grandpa seemed tense. His hands were shaking slightly as he grabbed his tackle box. I asked if he was feeling okay, and he brushed it off, saying the bumpy drive had just rattled his old bones. I didn't think much of it at the time. We got in his small rowboat and paddled out to the center of the lake. The water was incredibly clear. I could see straight down at least 20 feet to the rocky bottom. We baited our hooks and cast our lines, settling in for what I assumed would be a relaxing day of fishing. For the first hour or so, everything was normal. We made small talk and caught a few decent-sized trout, but I kept noticing Grandpa glancing nervously at the water, especially when ripples appeared on the surface. At one point, he nearly jumped out of his skin when a fish leaped nearby. "You okay, Grandpa?" I asked again. "You seem really on edge." He sighed heavily. "I suppose I should tell you why I brought you here today," he said, reeling in his line. "There's something you need to know about this lake." My stomach dropped. I had a feeling this wasn't going to be a fun family story. 50 years ago, I used to fish here all the time with my buddies, he began. It was our favorite spot, secluded, great fishing, beautiful scenery. But one day, everything changed. He paused, staring out at the water with a haunted look in his eyes. We were out in the boat, just like we are now. It was getting late in the day, and we were about to head in. That's when we saw it, a face just below the surface, pale white, with huge black eyes. At first we thought it was a swimmer in trouble, but then we realized it wasn't human. A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to believe this was just some tall tale, but the fear in Grandpa's voice was all too real. "We got out of there as fast as we could," he continued. "Didn't say a word to each other on the drive home. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe we'd had too much to drink. But deep down, I knew what I saw." "Did you ever come back?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded grimly. "Once, about a week later, I had to know if it was real. That's when I learned about Tommy." "Tommy?" "Local kid, about your age. He'd gone swimming in the lake alone and never came home. They found his clothes and towel on the shore, but no sign of him. Search and rescue dragged the lake for days, but never found a body." I felt sick to my stomach. Part of me wanted to demand we leave immediately, but another part was morbidly curious to hear more. "I've avoided this place ever since," Grandpa said. "But lately I've been having dreams. Nightmares, really. I see that face, those eyes calling to me. I knew I had to come back one last time to face it, and I wanted you here with me." Before I could respond, a loud splash erupted from the water behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding. That's when I saw it. Just below the surface, maybe 10 feet from our boat, was a face. Exactly as Grandpa described, chalk white skin, impossibly large black eyes, mouth frozen in a silent scream. It was only visible for a split second before vanishing into the depths, but that image is seared into my mind forever. I scrambled to grab the oars, ready to get the hell out of there. But Grandpa grabbed my arm. "Wait," he said, voice trembling. "Look." I followed his gaze to the water. At first, I saw nothing. Then slowly, shapes began to materialize in the crystalline depths. Humanoid figures, dozens of them, floating motionlessly. Men, women, children, all with the same ghastly pale skin and black eyes. I was paralyzed with terror. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of mass hallucination. But deep in my gut, I knew what I was seeing was all too real. Suddenly, the figures began to move. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, they started swimming upward toward our boat. Their faces were twisted in expressions of agony and hunger. "Row!" Grandpa yelled, snapping me out of my daze. "Row, damn it!" I don't know how we made it back to shore. Everything was a blur of panic and adrenaline. I remember the sound of hands slapping against the bottom of the boat, the feeling of icy fingers brushing against my legs as I hauled myself onto land. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck. As we peeled out of there, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The lake's surface was churning violently, pale arms reaching up from the water. We drove in silence for a long time, both of us trying to process what we'd just experienced. Finally, Grandpa spoke. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I shouldn't have brought you there. I thought maybe I was crazy, that if you saw it too, it would prove it was real. But now I wish more than anything that it had all been in my head." I didn't know what to say. Part of me was angry that he had put us in danger like that. But mostly, I was just grateful we had made it out alive. When we got back to Grandpa's house, we made a pact to never speak of what happened to anyone else. Who would believe us anyway? We'd be labeled as crazy or attention-seeking liars. It's been almost a year now, and I've mostly convinced myself that it was some kind of shared delusion brought on by Grandpa's story and the eeriness of the lake. But some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, the image of those pale faces and black eyes floating in the darkness of my room. I don't know what's really in that lake. Some kind of paranormal entity, an undiscovered species, or just the product of an overactive imagination. All I know is that I'll never go near that place again. And if you ever find yourself in a secluded lake in the woods and you see something strange beneath the surface, get out of there as fast as you can. You might not be as lucky as we were. Started like any other fishing trip. Dad left early Saturday morning, cooler packed with sandwiches and beer, tackle box rattling in the back of his old pickup. I remember waving goodbye from the porch, telling him to catch a big one for me. If only I'd known it would be the last time I'd see him. When he didn't come home that night, I wasn't too worried at first. Sometimes he'd lose track of time out there, especially if the fish were biting. But as Sunday morning rolled around with still no sign of him, a knot of dread started forming in my stomach. I called his cell repeatedly, straight to voicemail every time. By Sunday afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove out to the lake, heart pounding. As I pulled into the boat launch area, I saw his truck still parked there. Okay, I thought. Maybe he just camped out overnight. But then I scanned the lake and my blood ran cold. There was his little John boat, floating aimlessly in the middle of the lake. Empty. I called the police immediately. They came out with a search and rescue team, combing the entire lake and surrounding woods. They found nothing. No sign of struggle, no body, no clues whatsoever. It was like my dad had simply vanished into thin air. The next few weeks were a blur of frantic searching, talking to investigators, and hoping against hope that somehow, some way, we'd find him. But as the days turned to weeks, that hope started to fade. The official search was called off after a month. These things happen sometimes, they told us. People fall overboard, get disoriented, drown. But it didn't make sense. My dad was an excellent swimmer and they never found a body. That's when the dreams started. At first they were just flashes, glimpses of my dad's face, distorted and blurry as if seen through murky water. But they grew more vivid, more terrifying. In one recurring nightmare, I'm standing on the shore of Loch Morgan Lake. The water is black as ink, completely still. Then slowly, a figure begins to rise from the depths. It's my dad, but wrong somehow. His skin is pale and bloated, his eyes wide and glassy. He reaches out to me, mouth opening in a silent scream. I try to run to him, to help him, but my feet are rooted to the spot. Just before he sinks back under, I hear his voice, garbled and distant. "Help me, son. I'm still here." I wake up in a cold sweat every time, heart racing, the echo of his plea ringing in my ears. It feels so real, so vivid. I know it's just a dream, but part of me can't shake the feeling that it's more than that. That somehow my dad is trying to communicate with me. The dreams have been getting worse lately, more frequent, more intense. Sometimes I see other things in the water with him, dark shapes moving just beneath the surface, circling him like sharks. Other times, I catch glimpses of some kind of structure deep in the lake, like an ancient underwater city. It doesn't make any sense, I know. Loch Morgan Lake isn't even that deep. I've tried talking to people about it, my mom, my friends, even a therapist. They all say the same thing. It's just my mind's way of coping with the grief, trying to make sense of a senseless tragedy. But they don't understand. They haven't seen what I've seen in those dreams. Last week, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back to the lake to see it for myself. As I stood on the shore, staring out at those calm waters, a chill ran down my spine. It looked so peaceful, so ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from beneath the surface. I rented a boat and went out to the spot where they found my dad's boat that day. The water was crystal clear. I could see straight to the bottom. But as I peered over the side, the strangest thing happened. For just a split second, I swear I saw a face looking back up at me. Not my dad's face, but something else, something that didn't look entirely human. I jerked back so hard I nearly capsized the boat. By the time I steadied myself and looked again, whatever I'd seen was gone. But the image is burned into my mind. Those eyes, they weren't like anything I've ever seen before. I know how this all sounds. Believe me, I do. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I'd have thought they were crazy or on drugs. But I know what I saw, both in my dreams and in that lake. Something is not right about Loch Morgan Lake. Something took my father, and I'm starting to think it wasn't a simple drowning. I've been doing research, digging into the history of the lake. Turns out, my dad isn't the first person to go missing there. Over the past 50 years, there have been at least 6 other unexplained disappearances. All of them fishermen, all of them vanishing without a trace. The locals don't like to talk about it much, but I've managed to piece together some stories. Tales of strange lights seen beneath the water at night, of fish with bizarre mutations, of eerie sounds echoing across the lake when the moon is full. One old-timer I talked to, a guy who's lived by the lake his whole life, told me something that chilled me to the bone. He said that according to local legend, The lake isn't just a lake. It's a gateway, a portal to somewhere else. He wouldn't say where exactly, just that it was a place no living soul should ever see. I don't know what to believe anymore. Part of me knows how insane all of this sounds. But another part of me, the part that sees my dad reaching out to me every night in my dreams, can't let it go. I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere, trapped in some kind of in-between place, waiting for me to find him. I'm going back to the lake tomorrow. I've bought scuba gear, planning to search the bottom myself. I know it's dangerous, maybe even crazy, but I have to know the truth. I have to try to find my dad, or at least find out what happened to him. If anyone reading this has had similar experiences at Loch Morgan Lake, or knows anything about its history, please reach out to me. And if something happens to me, if I don't come back from this dive, at least there will be a record of what I've seen and heard. Maybe it will help someone else avoid the same fate. I don't know what I'm going to find down there in the depths of Loch Morgan Lake, but whatever it is, I'm not leaving until I get some answers. Dad, if you're out there somewhere, if you can hear me, I'm coming for you. Just hold on a little longer. The drive up to the lake was uneventful. We arrived Friday afternoon, loaded up our small motorboat, and headed out onto the water. It was a beautiful day. Clear blue skies, a light breeze, perfect fishing weather. We found a quiet cove and dropped anchor, cracking open our first beers as we baited our hooks. For the first few hours, everything was great. We caught a few decent-sized bass, laughed about old times, and soaked in the tranquility of nature. As the sun started to dip lower in the sky, we decided to head to a different spot before calling it a day. That's when things took a turn. As we were cruising across the lake, I noticed another boat in the distance. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as we got closer, I realized the two men on board were waving frantically at us. Mike slowed our boat as we approached. "Hey fellas, everything all right?" Mike called out. The men looked relieved to see us. One of them, a tall guy with a scraggly beard, shouted back, "Thank God. Our engine died and we've been stuck out here for hours. Any chance you could give us a tow back to shore?" Mike and I exchanged glances. It was getting late and we were hoping to set up camp soon, but we couldn't just leave these guys stranded. "Sure, we can help," I replied. "Just let me find a rope to tie your boat to ours." As I dug around for some rope, the two men maneuvered their boat closer. Now that they were near, I got a better look at them. The bearded guy seemed friendly enough, smiling and thanking us profusely. But his companion, a shorter, stocky man with cold eyes, made me uneasy. He didn't say a word, just stared at us intensely. We got their boat secured and started towing them towards the nearest dock, about 20 minutes away. The bearded guy, who introduced himself as Daryl, kept up a steady stream of chatter. He explained they were from out of town, visiting for a fishing weekend like us. His silent friend was named Ray. As we neared the shore, I started to relax a bit. We'd done our good deed for the day and could get back to our trip. But then Daryl threw us a curveball. "Listen, guys, I hate to ask, but we're in a bit of a pickle," he said. "Our cabin rental fell through at the last minute. Any chance we could camp with you tonight? We've got our own gear and everything. We'd be real grateful." I immediately tensed up. Spending the night with two strangers in a remote area? No way. But before I could say anything, Mike spoke up. Sure, I guess that would be okay," he said hesitantly. "We were planning to camp on the North Shore. You're welcome to join us." I shot Mike a look, but he just shrugged. I knew he felt bad for these guys. but I had a gnawing feeling in my gut that this was a mistake. We helped Daryl and Ray get their boat secured at the dock, then led them to our campsite. The whole time, Ray barely said 2 words. He just kept watching us with those unnerving eyes. As we set up our tents, Daryl kept thanking us for our kindness. He offered to share some whiskey he had packed as a gesture of appreciation. Against my better judgment, we accepted. The 4 of us sat around the campfire, passing the bottle. Daryl told stories and cracked jokes. Mike seemed to be warming up to them. But I couldn't shake my unease, especially when I caught Ray staring at me from across the flames. As it got later, we decided to turn in. Mike and I retreated to our tent, while Daryl and Ray took the other one about 20 feet away. I tried to sleep but kept tossing and turning, straining my ears for any unusual sounds. Just as I was finally drifting off, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a zipper being slowly opened. My eyes flew open and my heart started racing. I nudged Mike awake. "Someone's opening our tent," I whispered urgently. Mike sat up groggily. "What? Are you sure?" Before I could respond, a beam of light cut through the darkness as our tent flap was pulled back. A figure loomed in the entrance. "Don't move," a gruff voice commanded. It was Ray. "Keep quiet and nobody gets hurt." I was paralyzed with fear as Ray entered our tent, followed by Daryl. They both had hunting knives drawn. "All right, boys, here's how this is gonna go," Daryl said, his friendly demeanor from earlier completely gone. "You're gonna hand over your wallets, phones, and the keys to your boat. Nice and easy?" Mike started to protest, but Ray pressed his knife against Mike's throat. "I wouldn't if I were you, pal." With shaking hands, we surrendered our belongings. Daryl rifled through our bags, taking anything valuable. "Please," I managed to croak out, "just take what you want and go. We won't call the cops or anything." Daryl chuckled darkly. "Oh, we know you won't. Because if you do, we'll come back and finish what we started. Understand?" We nodded frantically. "Good," Ray growled. "Now here's what's gonna happen. We're gonna zip you up in this tent. You're gonna count to 500 before you even think about coming out. If you don't, well, let's just say it won't end well for you." They backed out of the tent and zipped it closed. We heard them rustling around the campsite for a few minutes, then the sound of our boat's motor starting up and fading into the distance. Mike and I lay there in stunned silence, too terrified to move. I don't know if we actually counted to 500, but it felt like hours before we worked up the courage to unzip the tent. Our campsite had been ransacked. They'd taken all our gear, our food, everything. We were stranded with no boat, no phones, and no supplies. It took us most of the next day to hike out to the nearest town and get help. We filed a police report, but they never found Daryl and Ray or our stolen belongings. It's been months since that night, but I still have nightmares about those cold, menacing eyes staring at me across the campfire. I've never gone camping or fishing since. The peace and solitude of nature that I once loved now fills me with dread. I know Mike and I were lucky to escape with our lives, but the terror of those moments, trapped in that tent and completely at the mercy of those 2 psychos, will haunt me forever. I keep wondering, what if we hadn't stopped to help them on the lake? What if we'd trusted our instincts and said no to them camping with us? I used to believe in the goodness of strangers. Now, I'm not so sure. That fishing trip taught me a harsh lesson about trust and the darkness that can lurk behind a friendly face. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. It was a Friday night, and I had been hanging out at my buddy Mike's place. We lost track of time playing video games and chatting, and before I knew it, it was past midnight. I said my goodbyes and headed out to my car, ready for the 45-minute drive home. As soon as I pulled out of Mike's driveway, I felt uneasy. The streets were eerily quiet, and the darkness seemed to press in on all sides. I cranked up the radio, trying to shake off the weird feeling. About 10 minutes into my drive, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another late-night driver. But as I continued down the winding country road, I realized the car behind me was matching my every turn. My heart started to race. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just going in the same direction, but something felt off. I sped up a little, and so did they. I slowed down, and they did too, always maintaining the same distance. I was starting to freak out. My palms were sweaty on the steering wheel, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The headlights seemed to bore into me, never wavering. I decided to pull into the next gas station I saw, hoping the other car would pass by. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a dimly lit gas station up ahead. I pulled in, my heart pounding. To my relief, the car behind me continued down the road. I let out a shaky breath, feeling silly for getting so worked up. I figured I might as well fill up while I was there. As I got out to pump gas, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The station was deserted, and the flickering fluorescent lights cast weird shadows. I kept glancing around nervously as I filled my tank. When I finished, I walked around to the driver's side and froze. There, tucked under my windshield wiper, was a small piece of paper. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. In messy handwriting were 3 words that made my blood run cold. I'm here. I whipped my head around, scanning the empty lot. There was no one in sight. How was this possible? The car that had been following me was gone. I jumped back in my car, locking the doors and starting the engine with shaking hands. As I pulled out of the station, I debated calling the police. But what would I say? That someone left me a creepy note? That I felt like I was being followed? It sounded ridiculous even to me. I decided to just get home as fast as possible. The rest of the drive was agonizing. Every shadow on the road looked like a person. Every set of headlights made me flinch. I kept checking my mirrors, sure I would see that car again. But the road behind me remained empty. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I nearly cried with relief. I sat in the car for a minute, trying to calm my racing heart. As I reached for the door handle, something caught my eye. There, tucked under my windshield wiper, was another piece of paper. My stomach dropped. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it. The same messy handwriting. I'm here. I scrambled out of the car, fumbling with my keys as I ran to the front door. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it, then ran around checking all the windows. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. The operator answered, and I tried to explain what was happening between gasping breaths. She assured me they were sending a patrol car and told me to stay inside with the doors locked. As I waited for the police, every creak of the house made me jump. I paced back and forth, peering out the windows. That's when I saw it, a car I didn't recognize, parked across the street. Its headlights were off, but I could see the silhouette of someone inside. I backed away from the window, my heart in my throat. Then I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from the back of the house. I froze, straining my ears. It came again, louder this time. It sounded like someone was dragging their nails across the siding. I wanted to run, to hide, but I was paralyzed with fear. The scratching moved around to the side of the house, getting closer to the front. Then it stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Bang, bang, bang. Someone was pounding on the front door. I bit back a scream, stumbling backwards. The pounding continued, growing more frantic. I could hear ragged breathing on the other side of the door. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw flashing lights through the window. The police had arrived. The pounding on the door immediately stopped. I ran to open the door for the officers, nearly collapsing with relief. They searched the property and the surrounding area but found nothing. No strange car, no person lurking in the shadows. The only evidence of my terrifying night were the 2 notes, which the police took as evidence. They told me they would increase patrols in the area and to call immediately if anything else happened. But nothing did. It was like whatever, or whoever, had been stalking me that night had vanished into thin air. It's been a month, and I still don't know what to make of what happened. Was it just some sick prank, or something more sinister? I've installed security cameras and always double-check my locks now. But I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me, waiting. And every time I get in my car at night, I check under the windshield wiper, half expecting to see another note telling me I'm here. It was about a month ago when I first noticed him. I was halfway through my shift, restocking the coolers, when the bell above the door chimed. I glanced up and saw this tall, scruffy-looking guy shuffling in. His clothes were all tattered and dirty, and he had this wild look in his eyes that immediately put me on edge. He wandered aimlessly up and down the aisles for a good 10 minutes, not really looking at anything. I kept an eye on him, thinking he might try to shoplift. Finally, he came up to the counter with a single bottle of water. As I rang him up, I noticed his hands were filthy and shaking slightly. He wouldn't make eye contact, just stared down at the floor. "That'll be $150, I said. He pulled out a crumpled bill and some change, counted it out painfully slowly, then grabbed his water and left without a word. I breathed a sigh of relief when he was gone. Something about that guy just felt off. But it wasn't over. The very next night, around 2 a.m., he showed up again. Same routine, wandered around, bought one water, avoided eye contact. This time I noticed he had a large scar across his cheek that I hadn't seen before. It looked fresh and angry. This pattern continued for nearly a week. He'd come in late at night, always alone, always buying just water. I started dreading his visits. The way he moved was so unnatural, like a puppet on strings, and I swear I could feel his eyes on me even when he wasn't looking my way. On the 6th night, things escalated. He came in as usual, but this time when he got to the counter, he finally looked me in the eyes. His gaze was intense, almost feverish. In a hoarse whisper, he said, "I've been watching you." Then he turned and walked out, leaving the water on the counter. I felt like I'd been dunked in ice water. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely count out the register at the end of my shift. I told my boss about the creepy guy, but he just laughed it off, said it was probably some harmless weirdo and not to worry about it. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The next night, I was on high alert, jumping every time the door chimed. Around 3 a.m., I glanced out the window and my heart nearly stopped. There he was, standing motionless in the parking lot, staring right at me. The fluorescent lights cast weird shadows across his gaunt face. He didn't move a muscle, just stood there watching me for what felt like hours. I called the cops, my voice shaking as I described the situation. They said they'd send a car out. But in the 10 minutes it took them to arrive, the guy vanished. The officer looked around but found no trace of him. He told me to call again if the man returned, but I could tell he thought I was overreacting. I barely slept that day, jumping at every little sound in my apartment. I seriously considered quitting, but I really needed the job. So I showed up for my next shift, a ball of nerves the entire time. But the strange man didn't appear. A few uneventful nights passed. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe he'd moved on. But then came the night that still gives me nightmares. It was about 4 a.m., and I was dozing a bit behind the counter. Suddenly I jolted awake with that feeling of being watched. I looked up and nearly screamed. The man's face was pressed against the glass door, his eyes wide and unblinking. His breath fogged up the glass as he just stared at me. I fumbled for my phone to call 911, but when I looked back up, he was gone. I ran to lock the door, my heart pounding. As I reached for the lock, I noticed something scrawled in the condensation his breath had left on the glass. It said, "Let me in." I scrambled back from the door, panic rising in my throat. That's when the lights flickered and went out, plunging the store into darkness. I could hear shuffling footsteps outside, circling the building. I crouched behind the counter, trying not to breathe, praying for the sun to come up. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a car pull up outside. Cautiously, I peeked out to see it was the morning delivery truck. As light began to creep across the sky, I finally felt safe enough to unlock the door. The driver gave me a weird look. I must have seemed half crazed. I quit that job the very next day. My boss thought I was nuts, but I didn't care. No paycheck was worth that terror. It's been weeks now, and I still haven't seen any sign of that man. But I can't shake the feeling that he's out there somewhere, watching and waiting. I've moved to a new apartment, changed my routines, but I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was just sleep-deprived and let my imagination run wild. But then I remember those eyes, that whispered voice saying he'd been watching me, and I know it was real. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I hope I never find out. All I know is I'm never working another night shift as long as I live.